On June 22, 2023, a Filipino maid broke a kitchen window at a villa in Ras Al Khaimah and screamed until security arrived. On the floor lay the body parts of her employer, 22-year-old Russian Alexandra Krivtsova, neatly arranged in plastic containers labeled in Arabic. Alexandra Krivtsova studied Arabic language and culture of Islamic countries at the Faculty of Oriental Studies in Nizhny Novgorod. In 2022, she registered on an international dating platform aimed at Muslims seeking serious relationships. In her profile, she indicated an interest in Islamic culture and a willingness to move to an Arab country. A few months later, a user named Abdul Halim bin Saeed al-Qasimi began corresponding with her. The man introduces himself as a 72-year-old widower and a distant relative of the ruling family of the Emirate of Ras Al Khaimah in the United Arab Emirates. According to him, he owns several meat processing plants and trading markets in the region. In his correspondence, he describes himself as a devout man who is looking for a young, educated wife for a quiet family life. Al-Qasimi emphasizes that he is ready to provide his spouse with comfortable living conditions and the opportunity to continue her education. Alexandra tells her family and friends about her acquaintance with an influential businessman from the UAE. She says that he is serious about marriage and is ready to formalize the relationship according to Islamic traditions. Her parents express concern about the large age difference and cultural differences, but Alexandra convinces them that this is her conscious choice. She says that she sees marriage as an opportunity to apply her knowledge of Eastern culture in practice. In early 2023, Alexandra flies to Dubai on a tourist visa. She meets her future husband at a hotel in the presence of several of his relatives. She calls home and reports that the man meets her expectations and looks respectable. 3 days later, she participates in a nikah ceremony, an Islamic religious rite of marriage. The procedure takes place in a private home in the presence of an imam and witnesses. After the ceremony, Al-Qasimi takes Alexandra's Russian passport, explaining that it is necessary to apply for a long-term residence visa. The girl moves into his villa on the outskirts of Ras Al Khaimah, a 2-story building surrounded by a high fence. Several Filipino maids work in the house who speak virtually no English. Alexandra is given a separate room and a set of traditional women's clothing. In the first weeks of her marriage, the girl maintains regular contact with her family and friends in Russia. She says that she is getting used to her new lifestyle, learning local traditions, and improving her knowledge of Arabic. Alexandra mentions that her husband demands strict religious observance, but explains that this is due to the peculiarities of the local culture. She says she feels safe, although she sometimes misses home. Gradually, the nature of Alexandra's messages begins to change. She communicates less frequently and responds to her relatives' questions more reservedly. The girl mentions that her husband does not approve of frequent communication with her former acquaintances and believes that his wife should devote more time to studying the Quran and household chores. Alexandra says that she is trying to find a balance between following the new rules and maintaining contact with her relatives. In April 2023, her calls home become even less frequent. Alexandra explains this by her busy schedule of religious classes and preparations for obtaining a permanent residence permit. Her parents express concern and ask for her husband's contact details, but she replies that he is against direct communication with her Russian family until all the formalities with the documents are completed. The last phone call with her parents took place at the end of April. Alexandra spoke briefly and seemed tense. She responded evasively to questions about her well-being and plans, citing fatigue and the need to keep quiet in the house. The girl promised to call back in a week, but the call never came. In May, her relatives tried to call Alexandra, but her phone was turned off. Appeals to the Russian consulate in the UAE were unsuccessful. No official information about problems with Russian citizens had been received. Her parents began searching through social networks and turned to acquaintances with connections in the region, but they were unable to obtain any information about Alexandra's whereabouts. The only channel of communication remained Alexandra's friend, a student from the same faculty, with whom the girl occasionally corresponded via messenger. In June, she received several voice messages from Alexandra, which were the last signs of life from her. In these recordings, the girl's voice sounded depressed and anxious. In the first message, Alexandra said that her husband spent most of the day at the mosque and hardly communicated with her at home. The girl complained of loneliness and strict restrictions on her movement around the house. She mentioned that the maids avoided contact with her and were clearly afraid to say anything. Alexandra said that she was not allowed to leave her room without a headscarf and appropriate clothing. In the second voice message, recorded a few days later, Alexandra described a strange smell of meat that was constantly present in the house. She noted that all the kitchen knives had disappeared from the tables and drawers, which she found unusual. The girl expressed growing concern about changes in her husband's behavior and the atmosphere in the house. The last voice message was sent on June 14th. In it, Alexandra said in a broken voice that the situation was becoming unbearable. She mentioned physical punishment for breaking the rules and asked her friend to find a way to contact her parents. The girl said she felt her life was in danger, but could not leave the house on her own. The recording cut off in the middle of a sentence. After sending her last voice message, Alexandra Krivtsova disappeared from all communication channels. Her friend tried to call and text her, but the messages remained unread. The girl's phone showed offline status in messengers. 8 days of complete silence ensued in Al-Qasimi's house, ending with the screams of a Filipino maid at the kitchen window. The events of June 20th unfolded rapidly. At around 2 p.m. local time, the residential complex's security received an emergency call from one of the houses. The dispatcher recorded a message that a woman was screaming and banging on the window, demanding help. The team on duty arrived at the scene 7 minutes later and found the Filipino maid in a state of extreme agitation in front of the first-floor kitchen window. The woman, named Maria Santos, had been working in the Al-Qasimi house for about a year, cleaning the living quarters. That day, she was supposed to do a thorough cleaning of the kitchen, but she did not have the key to the room. The maid tried to knock on the door, but got no response. Looking through the kitchen window, she saw plastic containers on the floor with contents that she initially mistook for meat products for freezing. Upon closer inspection, Maria realized that she was looking at human body parts. The containers held 2 arms, 1 leg from the knee to the foot, and part of a torso without a head. Everything was neatly packed and labeled with stickers in Arabic indicating that it was kosher frozen food. Next to the containers was an industrial meat grinder with remnants of biological tissue. The security guards called the police and an ambulance. The first group of law enforcement officers arrived 20 minutes later and immediately cordoned off the villa. The kitchen was declared a crime scene and closed for detailed investigation. 3 Filipino maids and Abdul Halim bin Said al-Qasimi himself were in the house, calmly reading the Quran in the living room. During his arrest, the 72-year-old man did not resist and remained completely calm. He answered the police's questions about what was happening in the kitchen in monosyllables, referring to his religious duties to cleanse the house of impurity. Al-Qasimi was taken to the Ras Al Khaimah police station for further questioning. A preliminary examination of the crime scene revealed many details indicating systematic violence. In the kitchen freezer, investigators found additional body parts: long dark hair, a lower jaw with teeth, and pieces of fabric with a name embroidered in Latin letters. Forensic tests confirmed that the hair belonged to a European woman in her 20s. Alexandra's personal belongings were found in her bedroom: clothes, cosmetics, Arabic language study materials, and a notebook with notes on local traditions. The wardrobe contained traditional women's dresses and headscarves purchased after she moved to the UAE. On the dressing table were Russian educational documents and a medical certificate for obtaining a visa. A search of Al-Qasimi's office yielded more disturbing findings. In the desk was a folder with marriage documents, including a copy of the nikah name, an Islamic marriage certificate. There was also Alexandra's confiscated Russian passport and a certificate of change of visa status, which had never been submitted to the relevant authorities. Investigators paid particular attention to a diary written in Arabic by Al-Qasimi. It contained detailed notes on his wife's behavior and the disciplinary measures applied to her. The entries began in January 2023 and documented the progressive tightening of punishments for various violations of the established rules. The first entries concerned relatively mild remarks: being late for prayer, incorrect reading of the Quran, insufficiently modest clothing in the presence of maids. Punishments were limited to deprivation of food for several hours or a ban on leaving the room. Gradually, the list of violations expanded to include attempts to contact relatives without permission, expressions of dissatisfaction with living conditions, and questions about the return of documents. By May, the entries had become more severe. Al-Qasimi recorded the use of physical punishment, blows with a wooden stick on the palms for refusing to perform household duties, being chained in metal shackles for attempting to leave the assigned room without permission, and forced reading of religious texts for several hours at a time. The last entries were dated mid-June and mentioned his wife's complete disobedience and the need to take drastic measures. Al-Qasimi wrote that the woman refused to recognize his authority as husband and head of the family, which contradicted Islamic principles of family life. He considered such behavior an insult to religious feelings and a threat to the spiritual purity of the home. In the basement of the villa, there was a small room with metal rings in the walls and shackles on chains. The maids testified that Alexandra was periodically locked in this room for several days without food or water as punishment for serious misdemeanors. In the room, investigators found traces of blood on the floor and walls, as well as scratches on metal surfaces left by fingernails. The home's video surveillance system included cameras in all living areas, including Alexandra's bedroom and the kitchen. Al-Qasimi explained this was necessary to monitor compliance with religious rules and family discipline. The camera recordings from the last 2 weeks before the incident had been completely deleted, but technical expertise partially restored some fragments. The restored footage captured a scene in the kitchen where Al-Qasimi forced Alexandra to perform humiliating acts. The girl was forced to crawl on the floor and ask for forgiveness for disobeying her husband. Other footage shows the man beating her on the back and legs with a leather belt, demanding that she repeat religious formulas in Arabic. A medical examination of the remains confirmed the victim's identity through dental records and DNA samples provided by relatives in Russia. A forensic medical expert determined that death was caused by asphyxiation due to compression of the neck with a leather belt. Injuries to the body indicated prolonged physical abuse, including multiple hematomas, broken ribs, and damage to internal organs. The condition of the victim's hands attracted particular attention from the experts. Her fingernails had been completely torn off, and her fingers had deep cuts and burns. These injuries had been inflicted shortly before her death and were evidence of torture. Tissue analysis revealed the presence of diazepam, a sedative that could have been used to suppress the victim's resistance. Toxicological testing also revealed traces of other medications that had not been prescribed to the girl by doctors. Residues of potent psychotropic substances were found in her body, which could cause disorientation and suppress volitional functions. This indicated the possible systematic use of chemical behavior control. The autopsy showed that some internal organs had been partially removed after death. In particular, part of the liver was missing, and other abdominal organs were damaged. The nature of the injuries indicated the use of professional meat-cutting tools, which was consistent with Al-Qasimi's work in the meat processing industry. Abdul Halim bin Saeed Al-Qasimi was questioned in the presence of an interpreter and a lawyer appointed by the suspect's family. The 72-year-old man appeared completely calm and answered the investigators' questions without showing any signs of emotional distress. His testimony was recorded in Arabic and then translated into English for the record. When asked directly about his wife's death, Al-Qasimi answered in the affirmative, but refused to admit that it was a crime. According to him, he had every right to punish his wife for disobeying religious precepts and family traditions. The man claimed that he had acted within the framework of Islamic law and fulfilled his duties as head of the family to maintain order in the home. The details of Alexandra's last days, as recounted by Al-Qasimi, were striking in their insensitivity. According to him, his wife constantly violated the established rules of conduct, refused to study the Quran, and showed disrespect to her husband. She tried to secretly contact relatives in Russia and expressed a desire to return home, which he considered a betrayal of her marital obligations. The decisive conflict occurred on June 18th, when Alexandra openly declared her intention to leave the house and seek help from the Russian consulate. Al-Qasimi regarded this as a final breach of marital fidelity and decided to apply the most severe punishment. He lured his wife into the basement under the pretext of needing to discuss her behavior, and there threw a leather belt around her neck. According to the defendant's testimony, Alexandra resisted and tried to free herself, but he held the belt until she stopped moving. After her death, Al-Qasimi moved the body to the kitchen, where he kept the meat-cutting tools he used in his business. The man explained that he dismembered the corpse because he believed it was necessary to cleanse the house of impurity, according to his understanding of religious norms. The dismemberment process took several hours. Al-Qasimi methodically cut up the body with an industrial meat grinder and sharp knives, placing the parts in labeled plastic containers for freezing. He planned to completely dispose of the remains through the waste processing system at one of his factories. He had already managed to remove and destroy the head and some organs before the crime was discovered. The testimony of 3 Filipino maids who worked in the house confirmed the systematic nature of the violence against Alexandra. Maria Santos, Rosa Fernandez, and Gloria Mendez gave detailed testimony about what they had observed over several months. The women were afraid to intervene because of threats of dismissal and deportation, but they secretly sympathized with the young Russian wife. According to the maids, Alexandra often spent days in confinement without food or water. Al-Qasimi locked her in the basement in metal shackles for the slightest misdemeanors: mispronouncing Arabic words, slow performance of household duties, attempts to talk to the servants without permission. The girl was visibly losing weight and becoming increasingly withdrawn and frightened. Particularly severe punishments followed Alexandra's attempts to contact the outside world. Al-Qasimi controlled all her communications and regularly checked her phone for unauthorized calls or messages. When he discovered violations, the punishment included beating her palms with a wooden stick and forcing her to read religious texts for hours in an uncomfortable position. Maid Rosa Fernandez recounted how Alexandra had repeatedly asked her for help in recent weeks. The girl begged her to find a way to send a message to the Russian consulate or contact her family in Russia. She said she feared for her life and felt that her husband was planning to harm her seriously. The maid wanted to help, but was afraid of losing her job and being punished. The house was under strict control, which made it virtually impossible to escape or seek help. All the windows were barred, the doors were locked with electronic locks, and the property was guarded around the clock. Alexandra had no access to money, documents, or means of communication without her husband's supervision. Even trips to the toilet and shower were monitored and limited in time. The psychological pressure was compounded by physical exhaustion. Alexandra was given minimal food, often forced to fast under religious pretexts, and compelled to perform exhausting household chores. She was forced to wash clothes by hand, scrub the floors on her knees, and perform other humiliating tasks as part of the process of teaching her obedience. The girl was denied medical care, even when she suffered serious injuries. Maids saw Alexandra suffering from infections caused by unsanitary conditions in the basement. She developed skin diseases, but Al-Qasimi considered illness to be punishment for sins and refused to seek medical attention. He prescribed treatment with prayers and readings from the Quran. Religious justification for violence played a central role in al-Qasimi's worldview. He considered himself a true believer in Islam who was following divine instructions on how to run a family. In his view, a wife had to be totally submissive to her husband as Allah's representative on earth. Any resistance was seen as blasphemy that needed to be severely punished. The investigation established that the online dating platform through which Alexandra and al-Qasimi met did not conduct sufficient user verification. The man provided false information about his marital status and character. In reality, he had been married 3 times, and all his previous marriages had ended with his wives disappearing under mysterious circumstances. Al-Qasimi's first wife, a Filipino woman named Lourdes Castillo, disappeared in 2016, 8 months after the wedding. Officially, she was declared to have left the country voluntarily, but her relatives claimed that she never contacted them after her disappearance. His second wife, Fatima Ahmed, a Pakistani woman, disappeared in 2019 under similar circumstances. The investigation into these earlier cases was reopened after al-Qasimi's arrest. The police discovered that in both cases, the women had complained to friends about their husband's abuse and expressed fear for their lives. Their passports were also confiscated under the pretext of processing documents, and their last contacts with relatives ceased suddenly and without explanation. A large-scale search was conducted on al-Qasimi's estate using special dogs and ground-penetrating radar equipment. 3 areas of disturbed soil were found in the garden behind the house, which could indicate burials. Exhumation revealed human remains, preliminarily identified as belonging to 2 women of Asian origin. Additional evidence was found in the storage rooms of al-Qasimi's meat processing plants. Workers confirmed that the owner periodically brought in additional biological waste for disposal in industrial furnaces. He explained this as necessary to destroy expired products, but the amount of waste did not correspond to the volume of production. An examination of financial documents showed that al-Qasimi used online dating platforms as a way to attract victims to satisfy his sadistic tendencies. He specifically sought out young, educated women from other countries who were in a vulnerable position and easily manipulated by the prospect of a secure life in a wealthy Arab country. The scheme was worked out in detail. Al-Qasimi created an attractive image of a successful businessman and devout Muslim seeking a life partner to start a traditional family. He promised his wives comfortable living conditions, the opportunity to study Islamic culture, and a religious education. After the women moved to the UAE, he isolated them from the outside world and gradually increased his control and violence. A psychiatric examination of al-Qasimi revealed signs of antisocial personality disorder with sadistic traits, but found him sane at the time of the crimes. The man was fully aware of the unlawful nature of his actions, but considered himself entitled to dispose of his wives' lives and deaths according to his perverted understanding of religious principles. The trial of Abdul Halim bin Saeed al-Qasimi was held in closed session by decision of the judicial authorities of Ras Al Khaimah. The official justification for the secrecy was the need to protect the dignity of the defendant's family and prevent negative impact on the emirate's reputation. Alexandra Krivtsova's relatives from Russia were denied participation in the trial on the pretext of lack of necessary documents and visa formalities. The defense was based on the claim that the defendant was mentally incompetent and unable to control his actions due to senile personality disorder. Al-Qasimi's lawyers presented the conclusions of private psychiatrists who diagnosed him with progressive dementia and religious hallucinations. According to their version, the man did not understand the illegality of his actions and acted under the influence of morbid fantasies. The Emirates Religious Council supported this version of the defense, stating that a true believer could not have committed such crimes in his right mind. Representatives of the clergy claimed that al-Qasimi's actions contradicted the fundamentals of Islam and could only have been the result of mental illness. This position allowed them to avoid accusations that the crimes were motivated by religious beliefs. The court deemed the testimony of the maids unreliable due to their dependent position and possible interest in receiving compensation. The defendant's lawyers argued that the Filipino women could have distorted the facts under the influence of promises of financial rewards from the victims' Russian relatives. The court took these arguments into account when evaluating the evidence. Examinations of the remains of al-Qasimi's previous wives did not provide conclusive results for additional charges. The condition of the bone tissue did not allow the cause of death to be determined with certainty, and the lack of documentary evidence of identity complicated identification. The investigation was forced to focus solely on the case of Alexandra Krivtsova as the only one with sufficient evidence. The prosecution sought the death penalty for premeditated murder with particular cruelty, but the defense insisted on a finding of insanity and referral for compulsory treatment. The court proceedings lasted several weeks, with religious authorities and medical experts participating. The position of influential members of the Emirates' ruling family, who advocated for the most lenient sentence possible, played a decisive role. The court's final decision was a compromise between the demands of justice and the need to preserve the reputation of the local elite. Abdul Halim bin Saeed al-Qasimi was found guilty of unintentional manslaughter due to mental disorder. The court ordered him to undergo compulsory treatment at a private psychiatric clinic in Ajman, with a review of the case in 5 years. This sentence caused outrage among Russia and human rights organizations, but official protests did not lead to a review of the decision. The UAE authorities stated that the sentence was in accordance with local law and took into account all the circumstances of the case. Russia's diplomatic attempts to secure a harsher punishment for the killer were met with formal excuses about the independence of the Emirates' judicial system. Alexandra Krivtsova's parents received official notification of their daughter's death only 2 months after the verdict was handed down. The document stated that the girl had died as a result of a domestic tragedy in the family and had been buried according to local traditions. Details of the crime and the trial were not disclosed on the pretext of protecting private information. Attempts by relatives to obtain the body for burial in Russia were rejected by local authorities. The official justification was the need to observe Islamic burial rituals and the impossibility of exhumation after religious rites had been performed. In reality, Alexandra's remains were cremated without the family's consent, and her ashes were scattered in the desert outside the city. Alexandra Krivtsova's Russian passport was destroyed by order of the local authorities as a document belonging to a person who had converted to Islam and taken a new name after marriage. The Russian consulate received notification that the citizen had voluntarily renounced her Russian citizenship in favor of the status of wife of a UAE citizen, which precluded further claims by the Russian side. The media in the UAE received tacit instructions not to cover the al-Qasimi case in order to avoid damaging the region's tourist appeal. Local journalists who attempted to investigate the circumstances of the crime faced obstacles in obtaining information and pressure from the authorities. Several publications in independent media outlets were quickly removed at the request of the censors. International human rights organizations tried to draw attention to the case as an example of systemic discrimination against women in some Arab countries. However, their efforts did not receive widespread attention due to the geopolitical interests of Western countries in maintaining good relations with the UAE. Economic ties proved to be more important than protecting human rights and justice for victims of crime. The private psychiatric clinic in Ajman, where al-Qasimi was treated, belonged to his distant relatives and provided the most comfortable conditions possible. The patient lived in a separate cottage on the grounds of the medical center, with personal staff and the ability to receive visitors. The treatment regime was more like a respectable vacation than forced hospitalization. Medical reports on al-Qasimi's condition were formal and contained standard phrases about the gradual improvement of the patient's mental health. The clinic's doctors regularly reported to the judicial authorities on the progress of the treatment and expressed optimistic predictions about the possibility of early release. None of the independent specialists were given access to examine the patient. 2 years after the start of treatment, Al-Qasimi's condition was reviewed by a medical commission, which concluded that he had made a full recovery and posed no danger to society. The man was discharged from the clinic with recommendations to continue outpatient observation and undergo regular preventive examinations. In fact, he was given complete freedom of action and the opportunity to return to his normal life. After his discharge, Al-Qasimi returned to managing his businesses and resumed his activity on online dating platforms under new names. Law enforcement agencies did not monitor him in any way, and his criminal record was formally expunged under an amnesty for persons suffering from mental disorders. The public was not informed about the killer's release and return to normal life. The case of Alexandra Krivtsova is one of many examples of how corruption, religious fanaticism, and legal irresponsibility can lead to impunity for the most brutal crimes. A young Russian student who dreamed of studying Eastern culture and starting a family became a victim of a system that values the reputation of influential families above human life and justice. When firefighters broke down the door of a mansion in Virginia, they found 2 charred bodies on the 2nd floor. But the real nightmare began when a detective noticed a strange crack in the floor of the wine cellar. Behind it was a 2nd basement where 5 women were being held in chains. Sheikh Saeed al-Mahdi flew to the United States at the end of August 2022. The 39-year-old member of Dubai's ruling family rarely appeared in the Western press, although his fortune was estimated at around $400 million. He spent most of his time between the Emirates and London, where he owned several properties through offshore companies. He did not visit America often. He was last seen in Miami 3 years ago at a yacht show. This time, his plane landed at a private terminal at Dulles Airport, near Washington. He was accompanied by Yana Kovalchuk, a 26-year-old model from Kiev. They had met 6 months earlier at a party in Monte Carlo organized by a mutual acquaintance, a Russian businessman involved in real estate in Europe. Yana worked for a mid-level modeling agency, modeled for clothing catalogs, and occasionally participated in shows at Milan Fashion Week. Her career was not spectacular, but it provided enough to travel and maintain the lifestyle she had dreamed of back in her native Kiev. After meeting Saeed, her life changed. He began inviting her to private events, paying for her flights, and giving her jewelry. Yana understood that their relationship had no future in the traditional sense. The sheikh was married and had 3 children, but she did not object to this arrangement. Money, attention, luxury, all this compensated for the lack of official status. Said bought an estate in Northern Virginia 2 years before his arrival, but he hardly ever visited it. The property was registered to a shell company registered in Delaware. The house stood on 12 acres of land, surrounded by forest. The nearest neighbors lived a kilometer away. It was an old colonial-style mansion built in the 1970s, with white columns at the entrance and a long driveway. Inside, everything looked solid, but unpretentious. Wood paneling on the walls, a fireplace in the living room, a spacious kitchen with marble countertops. Saeed rarely explained why he needed this house. He told his friends that he wanted a place for privacy where no one would ask questions. In the Emirates, he was always being watched by relatives, business partners, journalists. Here he could do whatever he wanted. The first few days after their arrival were quiet. Said and Yana hardly left the house. He worked remotely, calling partners, checking financial reports, discussing some land deals in Abu Dhabi. Yana sunbathed by the pool, leafed through magazines, and posted photos on social media. She didn't ask any unnecessary questions. Sometimes Saeed would leave for a few hours, saying he was meeting with lawyers or dealing with some real estate issues. Yana stayed alone, watched TV series, and ordered food through apps. She didn't know that there was a hidden room in the basement of the mansion, under the wine cellar, and she didn't know that someone was there. The fire started on the evening of September 12th. neighbors noticed smoke around 11 p.m. One of them called 911, but the house was far from the road, and it took firefighters 20 minutes to get there. When they arrived, the second floor was already engulfed in flames. The fire was coming from a bedroom in the east wing. The fire chief immediately realized that there might be people inside. There were 2 cars in the driveway, a rented SUV and a sedan. The firefighters tried to get in through the front door, but it was locked from the inside. They had to break it down with a battering ram. The smoke inside was so thick that they could hardly see anything. One of the firefighters climbed the stairs to the second floor, feeling his way. In the bedroom, he stumbled upon a body. A woman was lying on the floor next to the bed, with a man next to her. Both were dead. The fire had damaged their faces, making it impossible to identify them immediately. The bodies were taken outside. By this time, the Fauquier County Police and investigators from the sheriff's office had arrived. One of the detectives, Mark Lawson, immediately noticed some strange details. First, the bedroom door was closed from the outside, not locked, but tightly shut, which is unusual for a fire that starts inside a room. Second, there was an overturned canister on the floor next to the bed. Judging by the smell, it contained gasoline. An examination would later confirm that the liquid had been spilled on the carpet and set on fire. This was no accident. Someone wanted these 2 to burn. Lawson began his inspection of the house. Everything on the first floor looked relatively normal. No signs of a struggle, furniture in its place, dishes in the sink. There were fresh groceries in the refrigerator and glasses with wine residue on the table. It seemed like the evening had started normally. The detective went down to the basement. There was a laundry room, a small storage room, and a wine cellar, a room with wooden shelves lined with bottles. Lawson walked along the shelves, checking for anything unusual, and he noticed something. One of the shelves was slightly tilted, as if it had been moved recently. He tried to pull it, and it gave way. Behind it was a narrow door built into the wall. It was not locked. Lawson opened it and saw a staircase leading down to the second basement. He went down, holding a flashlight. Downstairs, there was a smell of dampness and something else, a sour, unpleasant smell of unwashed bodies. The room was small, about 15 by 10 meters, with a low ceiling and concrete walls. In the corner stood a mattress. Next to it, a plastic bucket. A metal pipe ran along the wall, to which chains were attached. And on these chains sat women, 5 women, all naked, all in handcuffs. Lawson called for backup. A few minutes later, 2 more police officers and a paramedic came down to the basement. The women were exhausted. Some of them could barely stand. They were immediately freed from their chains and carried upstairs. One of them was crying. Another was silent, staring at a single point. The third repeated something in broken English. "Please don't send me back. Please." The fourth and fifth seemed to be in a semi-conscious state and had to be carried. All of them were taken to the hospital. An examination established that the women had been held in the basement for several days to several weeks. All of them had signs of beatings, abrasions on their wrists and ankles from handcuffs, and signs of dehydration. Doctors also found signs of sexual assault on 3 of them. One of the women, 24-year-old Marina, told investigators that she had been brought there 3 weeks ago. She is from Moldova and came to the U.S. on a tourist visa, hoping to find work. In Washington, she responded to an advertisement for a housekeeper position. She was given an appointment at a cafe, where she was met by a tall, bearded man with an accent. He said the job was in a country house and paid well. Marina agreed. The man drove her to the mansion, took her inside, and then forced her down to the basement. 2 other women were already there. He chained Marina up and told her she would work when the time came. She hardly saw him again. Food was brought once a day, usually bread, canned goods, sometimes fruit. Water was provided in plastic bottles. Another woman, 28-year-old Oksana from Ukraine, told a similar story. She too was lured with the promise of work. She arrived in the US 6 months ago, lived in New York, and worked part-time as a waitress. She didn't have enough money and was looking for something more stable. She found an ad in a Russian-speaking group on social media. A caregiver was needed for an elderly person in Virginia. Oksana contacted the employer, and they agreed to meet. She was met by the same man who later brought her to the mansion. By the time Oksana realized she had fallen into a trap, it was too late. He was stronger than her and had a gun. She tried to scream, but he hit her in the face and dragged her into the basement. She spent 11 days there. The other 3 women hardly spoke. One of them did not know English at all and communicated through an interpreter. She came from Romania, and her story was vague. Something about an agency that promised work in Europe. Then she was resold and ended up in America. The second was from the Philippines, the third from Colombia. They all ended up here through different intermediaries, but the pattern was the same: a promise of work, a meeting with a man who drove them to the mansion, and confinement in the basement. The police began searching for this man. The description matched: tall, about 40 years old, bearded, dark-skinned, with an accent. Surveillance cameras at a nearby store recorded a car that regularly visited the mansion, a dark van with no identifying marks. The license plate number was identified. The car was registered to a certain Ahmed Suleiman, a 38-year-old Jordanian citizen living in Washington. The police went to his address, but the apartment was empty. Neighbors said they hadn't seen him for several days. No one answered his phone. Meanwhile, the identities of the victims were established through fingerprints and dental records. The man was Saeed al-Mahdi, a sheikh from Dubai, a millionaire and member of the ruling family. The woman was Yana Kovalchuk, a model from Ukraine. Investigators checked their phones, which had been seized at the scene. In Saeed's correspondence, they found messages with a contact saved as A. They corresponded in Arabic. Experts translated the messages, which were about delivering goods, new girls, and preparing the premises. The last message from Saeed was sent 2 days before the fire. "Come tomorrow evening. We need to discuss something." A theory began to take shape. Said did not just buy the house for privacy. He used it to house women supplied to him by Ahmed. Most likely it was part of human trafficking. Women were lured to the US under the guise of work and then held captive. Some of them may have been used for prostitution, others for personal needs. Said paid Ahmed for the supplies. But something went wrong. Perhaps Yana found out about the basement, or Ahmed decided to get rid of Saeed so he wouldn't have to share the profits. Or there was a quarrel. There was no concrete evidence yet, but the arson theory seemed the most likely. Someone wanted to cover up the crime by starting a fire, but didn't take into account that the women in the basement would survive. The search for Ahmed continued. His photo was sent to all airports, border crossings, and police stations. 3 days later, a lead came in. A camera at a gas station in Maryland had captured a van similar to his heading north. The police organized a manhunt. Ahmed was detained at the Pennsylvania border as he attempted to cross the state, heading towards Canada. In the car, they found a passport with a different name, a wad of cash, and a phone that he had tried to destroy, but didn't have time to. The data was recovered. There were messages with Saeed, photos of the mansion, and contacts of other people allegedly involved in human trafficking. Ahmed was taken to a temporary detention center. He refused to speak without a lawyer. When the lawyer finally arrived, Ahmed began to testify. He claimed that he had nothing to do with the fire. He said that he worked for Saeed. He brought women, looked after them, but nothing more. He did not start the fire. On the night of the fire, he was in Washington, D.C., and he had an alibi, receipts from a bar, and witnesses. Investigators checked and found that his alibi was partially, but not completely confirmed. He was indeed seen at the bar, but he left around 10 p.m. The fire started at 11 p.m. He had time to get to the mansion, set the fire, and return. But there was no direct evidence, no fingerprints on the canister, no witnesses who saw him near the house that night. The case had reached a dead end. The investigators went back to the beginning. Lawson and his partner, Detective Emily Zhang, began questioning the women from the basement in more detail. They wanted to understand who else might be connected to this story, besides Saeed and Ahmed. Marina, who had been held captive the longest, remembered some details. She said that another man, not Ahmed, had come down to the basement several times. He was younger, around 30, and spoke English without an accent. He came to check on the women and sometimes brought them medicine, painkillers and antibiotics. Marina thought he was a doctor or someone like that. He wasn't cruel, he didn't beat them, but he didn't help them either. He just did his job, silently, as if it were a normal routine. Lawson asked Marina to describe this man in more detail. She remembered that he was tall, thin, with light hair, and wore glasses. He had a tattoo on his arm, some kind of inscription, but she couldn't make it out. He didn't talk much, mostly asking if anyone had a fever or was in pain. Once he gave Marina some pills for a headache. Another time, he bandaged a wound on Oksana's leg. She had cut herself on the edge of a metal chain and it had become infected. This man came, treated the wound, and applied a bandage. Marina asked him why he was there, why he was doing this. He didn't answer, just looked at her and left. Zhang suggested that he might be someone from the medical staff, perhaps even legally employed, a paramedic, a nurse, or maybe a medical college student. Someone who had access to medicine and knew the basics of first aid. They requested data from hospitals and clinics within a 50-mile radius of the mansion, looking for employees who might fit the description. At the same time, they checked Saeed and Ahmed's phone records. Perhaps one of their contacts would match. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. One of the police officers working at the scene of the fire remembered seeing a medical bag in the mansion's garage. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, assuming it was just a first aid kit, which every home has. But now, after Marina's words, it became important. Lawson returned to the mansion, which was still cordoned off as a crime scene, and found the bag. Inside were syringes, ampoules of saline solution, antibiotics, painkillers, bandages, tourniquets, and gloves. Everything was packed professionally, like in an ambulance. One of the ampoules had a sticker with the name of the pharmacy, a small pharmacy in Fairfax, 20 miles from the mansion. The detectives drove there. The pharmacy owner, an elderly man named Roger Patton, said that such ampoules were only sold by prescription or to medical institutions. He checked the database. These specific drugs had been ordered twice in the last month, once by a clinic in Fairfax, and the second time by a private individual. The name in the database was Daniel Corrado. Roger remembered him, a young guy who said he worked as a paramedic and needed supplies for field work. He showed his license. Everything was in order, so Roger sold him the drugs without question. The police found Daniel Corrado within a few hours. He was 31 years old and did indeed work as a paramedic for a private medical company that served corporate events, sports competitions, concerts, and sometimes private parties. He lived alone in a small apartment in the suburbs of Washington, with no family. Neighbors said he was quiet, polite, and rarely socialized. When the police came to his door, he opened it calmly, without panic. Lawson immediately noticed a tattoo on his right arm, an inscription in Latin letters, something like a quote, but he didn't have time to make it out clearly. Daniel was taken to the police station for questioning. He did not deny that he knew Ahmed. He said that they had met a year ago in a bar, struck up a conversation. Ahmed learned that Daniel worked in medicine and offered him a side job to occasionally come and check on the health of people who needed help, but did not want to go to the hospital. Daniel agreed. Ahmed paid well, $500 per visit, in cash, no questions asked. At first, Daniel thought they were illegal immigrants who were afraid of deportation. That's how Ahmed explained it. Then Daniel began to realize that it wasn't that simple. He saw women in the basement, saw chains, saw their condition. But he was afraid to ask questions. He was afraid that if he refused, Ahmed would do something bad to him or his family. Daniel didn't have a family, but Ahmed hinted that he knew where he lived and where he worked. Lawson asked how many times Daniel had come to the mansion. He replied that he had been there about 10 times in the last 6 months. Ahmed always called him, saying that he needed to check on the girls. Daniel would come, go down to the basement, examine them, give them medicine if necessary, and leave. He never asked any unnecessary questions. Once he asked Ahmed why these women were here, why they were chained. Ahmed replied that it was none of his business, that he should do his job and get paid. Daniel fell silent. Since then, he had simply done what was asked of him. Zhang asked if Daniel knew about Saeed. He nodded. He had seen him once, by chance. He had come at Ahmed's request, gone up to the first floor, and there was a man there, well-dressed, with an expensive watch, talking on the phone in another language. Ahmed introduced him as the master of the house, said didn't even look at Daniel, continued his conversation, and left. They never met again, but Daniel understood that Saeed was the boss, that he was the one who organized everything, and Ahmed just followed orders. The investigators asked about the night of the fire. Daniel said he wasn't there. Ahmed hadn't called him for several days before that. The last time Daniel had come to the mansion was a week before the tragedy, to check on the women, and everything was relatively normal. No emergencies. He left, and Ahmed didn't call him again. When Daniel heard about the fire on the news, he was frightened. He realized that sooner or later the police would get to him, but he didn't run away. He decided to wait. Maybe he thought they wouldn't find him, or maybe he just didn't know what to do. Lawson didn't quite believe him. He asked why Daniel hadn't gone to the police if he knew something illegal was going on. He replied that he was afraid. He was afraid of Ahmed, afraid of the consequences, afraid that he would be accused of complicity, and he was afraid of losing money. Daniel was in debt, a car loan, tuition for his younger brother who was in college, rent arrears. The $500 per visit helped him stay afloat. He knew it was wrong, but he continued, because he needed the money, because he had no choice. That's how he explained it. Detectives couldn't charge Daniel with arson. He had an alibi. He was at work on the night of the fire, which was confirmed by his colleagues. But he could be charged with complicity in human trafficking and illegal detention. He didn't rescue the women. He didn't report them to the police. He continued to help them, thereby helping the criminals keep their victims alive so they could continue to exploit them. The prosecutor decided that this was enough to bring charges. Daniel was arrested and taken into custody. Meanwhile, they began questioning Yana Kovalchuk. More precisely, they began reconstructing her story because she herself had died. The police contacted her family in Kiev, her mother and younger sister. Her mother, Lyudmila, said that she last spoke to her daughter 2 days before her death. Yana called and said that everything was fine, that she was in America with a friend, relaxing. She sounded cheerful. There was no sign of trouble. Lyudmila did not know the details of Yana's relationship with Saeed. She only knew that her daughter was dating a wealthy man who traveled a lot. Yana didn't talk much. She was secretive in general and didn't like to share personal details. Investigators checked Yana's phone. In her correspondence with her friends, there were mentions of Saeed. She wrote that he was generous but strange, that he sometimes behaved unusually. He might leave in the middle of the night without explaining where he was going, or lock himself in his office for several hours without answering his phone. One of her friends asked if this was dangerous. Yana replied that no, he was just a busy man. But in another correspondence, a few days before her death, Yana wrote to another friend, "Something's not right here. I can feel it." Her friend asked what exactly. Yana replied, "I can't explain it. Just strange noises at night, as if someone is downstairs." Then she added, "Maybe it was just my imagination." She did not return to the subject. This correspondence made investigators think. Perhaps Yana heard women in the basement. Perhaps she began to suspect that something suspicious was going on in the house. If Saeed realized that she had guessed, he might have tried to get rid of her. But then why start a fire in which he himself died? The theory that Saeed killed Yana and then killed himself by starting a fire seemed strange. If he wanted to die, why choose this method? It would have been easier to take pills or shoot himself. Fire is slow, painful, and unpredictable. The investigators returned to the theory of a third party. Someone came to the house, doused the bedroom with gasoline, locked the door, and set it on fire. That someone could have been Ahmed, but his alibi held up. Zhang suggested checking the surveillance camera footage in the area. The mansion itself was not equipped with cameras, but there were cameras on neighboring properties and on the roads. The police requested recordings from the week before the fire and the night of the tragedy. A camera at an intersection 3 miles from the mansion captured Ahmed's van passing by around 9 p.m. on the night of the fire. He was driving in the direction of the mansion, but he was not filmed going back. Either he returned by another route or he stayed there. A camera at a gas station 10 miles away recorded the same van around 1 a.m. after the fire. It turns out that Ahmed was indeed near the mansion at the right time. Detectives questioned Ahmed again. They showed him the recordings. He changed his testimony. He said that yes, he had come to the mansion that night, but he did not go inside. Said had called him, asked him to come, said they needed to discuss something urgent. Ahmed arrived, parked at the gate, and called Saeed. Said did not answer. Ahmed waited for about 20 minutes, then left. He saw smoke on his way back, but did not think much of it. He thought someone was burning trash. Lawson didn't believe him. He asked why he hadn't mentioned it right away. Ahmed replied that he was afraid he would be blamed. The detective asked if he had gone inside the house. Ahmed said no. They asked if he had seen anyone else nearby. Ahmed said no, no one. But then, after a few minutes of silence, he added that maybe there had been. When he was driving up, he saw another car parked off to the side, near the woods. It was a small, dark-colored sedan. He didn't think much of it at the time. He thought it was one of the neighbors. The police began searching for this car. They checked the camera recordings, and indeed, half an hour before Ahmed's van drove by, the same camera had recorded a dark sedan moving towards the mansion. The license plate was not visible. The camera was old, and the quality was poor. But they were able to determine the make approximately. It looked like a Honda Accord or a Toyota Camry, both common models. Investigators compiled a list of all similar cars registered in the area. There were 1,300 of them. They began checking the owners, looking for connections to Saeed, Ahmed, and Daniel. One of the detectives noticed a call log on Saeed's phone. 3 days before the fire, he had received a call from an unknown number, an unregistered, prepaid SIM card. The conversation lasted 2 minutes. It was impossible to determine who had called or what they had talked about. But the same number had called Ahmed the day before the fire. It couldn't have been a coincidence. Someone else was coordinating their actions, or threatening them, or making arrangements. The police tried to locate the phone using cell towers. They were somewhat successful. The calls came from the Washington area, but they couldn't determine the exact address. The number was no longer in use after the night of the fire. The phone had apparently been thrown away or destroyed. The detectives returned to the women. They asked if they had seen anyone else besides Ahmed, Daniel, and Saeed. Oksana remembered that a few days before the fire, someone else had gone down to the basement. A woman. Young, around 25 to 30 years old. dark hair, thin, spoke with an accent, possibly Eastern European. She came with Ahmed, examined the women, and wrote something down in a notebook. Oksana thought she was a buyer, that they were being checked before the sale. The woman asked questions: where they were from, how old they were, if they had any illnesses. Oksana refused to answer. The woman shrugged and left. Oksana didn't see her again. This was a new lead. The investigators asked Oksana to describe the woman in more detail. She was tall, about 170 centimeters, slim, with shoulder-length, straight, dark brown hair. She had an oval face, a small nose, and thin lips. She was dressed modestly: jeans, a dark jacket, and sneakers. No jewelry, as far as Oksana could remember. The police compiled a photo fit based on Oksana's description and began their search. At the same time, they checked Saeed's financial transactions. Bank statements showed that he regularly withdrew cash, $10,000 to $15,000 a month. These were large sums, unusual for ordinary purchases. Most likely, he used this money to pay Ahmed and other participants in the chain. But there were also transfers, several transactions to offshore accounts through shell companies. Investigators were unable to immediately determine who owned these accounts. International inquiries were required, and that took time. One of the transactions caught their attention. A month before the fire, Saeed transferred $50,000 to an account belonging to a company registered in the British Virgin Islands. The name of the company meant nothing. It was just a string of letters and numbers. But when investigators began to dig deeper, it turned out that this company had ties to several other entities in Eastern Europe, in Moldova, Romania, and Ukraine. All of these companies were involved in recruitment in one way or another. Officially, they were employment agencies that helped people find work abroad. But in reality, many of them were fronts for human trafficking. The police contacted Interpol. It turned out that several of these agencies were already under investigation by law enforcement. They were suspected of recruiting women for sexual exploitation. But there was not enough evidence, so no cases were opened. Now the investigators had a concrete lead. They requested information about the employees of these agencies, photos, data. One of the profiles matched the photo fit of the woman Oksana had seen. Her name was Elena Rusu, 32 years old, a citizen of Moldova. Officially, she worked as a manager at one of the agencies in Chisinau. But according to Interpol records, she had been detained several times in different countries on suspicion of human trafficking. But each time she was released due to lack of evidence. Investigators began searching for Elena Rusu in the United States. They contacted the Immigration Service and found out that she had entered the country on a tourist visa 2 months before the fire. She flew back to Moldova a week after the tragedy. Her whereabouts are currently unknown. Moldovan police reported that Elena had not appeared at her place of residence, and her phone was not answering. Most likely she went into hiding, knowing that she would be hunted down. But her role in this story was becoming clearer. Most likely, Elena was the coordinator. She connected agencies in Eastern Europe with buyers in the United States. She recruited women, arranged for their delivery, and checked the merchandise before handing them over to clients. Said was one of those clients. Ahmed acted as a local intermediary. He met the women, brought them to the mansion, and controlled them. Daniel provided medical assistance to keep the victims in relatively normal condition. Zhang mapped out the entire chain. At the top was Saeed, who financed the operation and used the women for his own purposes. He may also have sold some of them to other buyers, although there was no direct evidence of this yet. Below him was Elena Rusu, who recruited and transported victims from Eastern Europe. Further down was Ahmed, who did the dirty work on site. And at the very bottom was Daniel, who helped keep the women alive without asking questions. But who started the fire? That question remained unanswered. Ahmed swore he didn't set the house on fire. Daniel was at work. Elena had already left the country. That left one possibility. someone else, whom the investigators had not yet found, or Saeed himself. Maybe he really had decided to kill himself, and Yana just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Lawson ordered an additional examination of the scene of the fire. Experts returned to the burned-out mansion and conducted a detailed analysis. They discovered an interesting detail. On the bedroom floor, under a layer of ash, they found shoe prints, a partially preserved sole print, size 43, men's shoes. The tread pattern indicated Nike sneakers. The experts compared them with Saeed's shoes. He wore size 42. Not a match. So there was someone else in the bedroom. This clue gave investigators a new lead. They checked Ahmed's shoes. Size 44 didn't match. Daniel's, 43, a match. But Daniel was at work, his alibi confirmed by video recordings from cameras in the building where he worked that night. He couldn't physically be in two places at once, unless he had an accomplice. The detectives returned to question Daniel. They asked if he had a partner, someone else who could have come to the mansion. Daniel denied it. He said he worked alone and didn't involve anyone else. But when Lawson showed him a photo of the shoe print and said that the size matched his, Daniel turned pale. He paused. Then he said he had a brother, a younger brother, 19 years old, named Kyle. Daniel sometimes gave him his old shoes, including sneakers. That changed everything. The police immediately began searching for Kyle Corrado. It turned out that he was a freshman at a local college, studying business administration. He lived in a dorm on campus. When the detectives arrived there, he was not there. His roommate said that Kyle had left a few days ago, saying he was going to visit relatives. He didn't say when he would be back. Investigators contacted Kyle's parents. They had divorced many years ago. His mother lived in Pennsylvania, his father in Ohio. Both said they hadn't seen their son in several months. He hadn't visited them. The police put out a warrant for his arrest. The detectives returned to Daniel. They asked where his brother might be. Daniel said he didn't know. They weren't very close and rarely communicated. Lawson asked directly if Kyle knew what was going on in the mansion. Daniel hesitated, then admitted that yes, he did. Once, Kyle came to his house, found a medical bag, and started asking questions. Daniel told him that he was doing some side work, helping people who couldn't go to the hospital. He didn't mention the women in the basement, but Kyle wasn't stupid. He guessed that something was wrong. He insisted that Daniel stop. He said it was dangerous, that he could get arrested. They argued. Kyle said that if Daniel didn't stop, he would take care of it himself. Daniel decided it was just talk and didn't think much of it. Lawson asked when that was. Daniel replied, about a week before the fire. Everything coincided. Perhaps Kyle decided to take action. Maybe he went to the mansion to free the women, or to scare Syed, or to get Daniel out of this story once and for all. But something went wrong. Maybe Syed caught him. A fight broke out. Kyle grabbed a can of gasoline. It was in the garage. Syed used it for the lawnmower, and in a fit of rage, he doused the bedroom and set it on fire without thinking about the consequences. Or maybe it was cold-blooded murder. Zhang checked Kyle's phone records. The day before the fire, he called Daniel several times, but Daniel didn't answer. Then Kyle sent him a message. "I'll take care of it myself." Daniel read it but didn't reply. He thought his brother was just threatening him to scare him. He didn't think Kyle would actually do anything. The search for Kyle continued for several days. His photo was sent to all states, and cameras on roads, at airports, and at bus stations were checked. Finally, information came in from Texas. Local police detained a young man resembling Kyle at a gas station near the Mexican border. He was trying to buy food with cash and was acting nervously. When the police asked for his ID, he tried to run away. They caught up with him, handcuffed him, and checked his ID. It was Kyle Corrado. He was taken back to Virginia. For the first few hours, he remained silent, refusing to speak without a lawyer. When the lawyer finally arrived, Kyle began to testify. He confessed to setting fire to the mansion. He said he didn't want to kill anyone. He just wanted to save the women. He knew his brother had gotten involved with bad people and decided to put an end to it. On the evening of September 12th, he drove to the mansion. He parked his car in the woods and walked the rest of the way. He saw that the lights were on in the house. He knocked on the door. A man opened it, said. Kyle said he was Daniel's brother and had come to talk. Said, "Let him in." They went into the living room. Kyle asked where the women were. Said was surprised and said he didn't understand what he was talking about. Kyle raised his voice and demanded to see the basement. Said refused and told him to leave. Kyle didn't leave. Instead, he started looking for them himself, went into the kitchen, opened the door to the basement, and went down. He found the wine cellar and found a hidden door. He went down to the second basement. He saw the women. He wanted to free them. He tried to break the chains, but they were too strong. The women screamed and begged for help. Kyle ran upstairs looking for tools. Syed blocked his way. He had a gun in his hands. He told Kyle that he had made a mistake, that now he would have to pay. Kyle was scared. He grabbed the first thing he could find, a can of gasoline that was standing by the garage door. He swung it at Syed. Syed fired, but missed. The bullet hit the wall. Kyle threw the canister at him, spilling gasoline on the floor. Syed slipped and fell. Kyle ran upstairs to the bedroom, where he thought he could lock himself in and call the police. But Yana was there. She was screaming, demanding an explanation. Kyle tried to calm her down, saying that the police would be there soon. But Syed had already climbed the stairs, banging on the bedroom door, threatening them. Kyle panicked. He saw the gasoline that had spilled on his clothes and shoes. He took out his lighter. He smoked and always carried it with him. He thought that if he created a fire hazard, Syed would back off. He spilled some gasoline on the floor by the door and flicked his lighter. The fire ignited instantly, faster than he expected. The flames spread across the carpet and shot up to the curtains. Kyle tried to put them out, but couldn't. Yana screamed. He grabbed her by the hand and tried to pull her out the window, but it wouldn't open. The old frames were stuck. Smoke filled the room. Kyle was suffocating. He rushed to the door and tried to open it, but it wouldn't budge. Syed had locked it from the outside and propped it with something heavy. Kyle banged on it and screamed, but his strength was fading. The last thing he remembered was falling to the floor and losing consciousness. He woke up on the street. At first, he didn't understand how he got there. Then he remembered. The window had broken from the heat, and he had fallen out. Or crawled out, he couldn't remember. He stood up and looked around. The house was on fire. Flames were bursting out of the windows. Kyle realized that Yana was still inside. He wanted to go back, but couldn't. The heat was too intense. He heard sirens. The fire department was on its way. He was scared. He ran to his car, got in, and drove away. He didn't think about the consequences. He just ran. Investigators listened to his testimony. They checked it. The story generally matched the evidence. A bullet lodged in the wall on the first floor confirmed that there had been a shootout. The shoe print in the bedroom matched Kyle's size. The clothes he had worn that night were in the trunk of his car, covered in soot and smelling of gasoline. The DNA on the fabric matched his DNA. But Kyle's version raised questions. First, if Syed locked the door from the outside, how did he himself die in the fire? Experts returned to the scene and examined the bedroom door. It had indeed been propped open by a heavy dresser that stood in the hallway. But the dresser was not completely burned, and it could have been moved. Perhaps Syed blocked the door to prevent Kyle from escaping, but then he himself did not have time to escape. The fire spread too quickly, blocking the way to the stairs. He returned to the bedroom, trying to escape through the window, but suffocated first. So did Yana. Their bodies were found together. Second, Why didn't Kyle call the fire department immediately after he got out? He explained that he was panicked and afraid and couldn't think clearly. The lawyer insisted that it was an accident, that Kyle didn't want to kill anyone, that he acted out of good intentions, trying to save the women. The prosecutor objected, saying that Kyle deliberately set the room on fire, knowing that there were people inside. It was murder, albeit unintentional. The case was sent to court. Kyle was charged with the unintentional murder of 2 people, arson, and trespassing. Daniel was charged with complicity in human trafficking and unlawful detention. Ahmed was charged with human trafficking, kidnapping, unlawful detention, and aiding and abetting. Elena Rusu remained at large and was charged in absentia with organizing human trafficking. 5 women from the basement received medical care and psychological support. 3 of them were deported to their home country. They did not have legal status in the U.S., although human rights organizations tried to obtain temporary visas for them as victims of crime. 2 others, Marina and Oksana, agreed to stay and testify in court. They were given witness protection and temporary asylum. The investigation was still ongoing. Investigators were trying to find other members of the chain, those who helped recruit women in Europe, those who financed the operation besides Saeed. International requests were slow, and bureaucracy slowed down the process. But Lawson and Zhang did not give up. They understood that this case was just the tip of the iceberg, that there were dozens, if not hundreds, of similar schemes out there, and they wanted to destroy them all. The story of Sheikh Saeed al-Mahdi and his basement in Virginia did not receive widespread press coverage. The Sheikh's family used their connections to minimize media attention. A few small articles appeared in local newspapers, but the major publications avoided the topic. Officially, this was explained by the fact that the case was under investigation and disclosure of details could interfere with justice. Unofficially, it was due to pressure from influential people who did not want Saeed's name and his connections to human trafficking to become public knowledge. But for those directly affected by this story, the women who survived the nightmare in the basement, the investigators who uncovered the crime, the families of the victims, it remains an open wound. On March 21, 2024, Dubai police discovered the body of 21-year-old Indian student Amina Paraman in a private mansion in the Al Barsha district. Her husband, 53-year-old businessman Mansour bin Hamad al-Mazroui, claimed it was an accident, but marks on the girl's neck suggested otherwise. Amina Paramanan was born and raised in a small town in the state of Kerala in southern India. Her family was not wealthy, but her parents tried to give their daughter an education. The girl was in her 3rd year at a local college, studying business administration. According to her classmates, Amina was a quiet, modest student who rarely participated in social events and spent most of her time studying. She had no close friends, did not attend parties, and hardly used social media. Her Instagram profile contained only a few photos from family celebrations. Amina's parents, like many conservative Indian families, held traditional views on marriage. When the girl turned 20, her mother began actively looking for a suitable husband for her. At first, local candidates from their community were considered, but most families refused because of the modest dowry that Amina's parents could offer. The girl's father worked as a clerk in a government agency, and his salary barely covered the living expenses of the family of 5. Amina had 2 younger sisters who were also about to get married. In December 2023, Amina's mother contacted a marriage agency in a neighboring town. The agency specialized in international marriages, mainly with grooms from the Persian Gulf countries. The agency's owner, Rashid Hussein, had been working in this field for 15 years and had connections with several similar agencies in the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar. The process was simple. Indian families provided photographs and basic information about their daughters, and the agency passed this information on to partners in Arab countries, where it was shown to potential grooms, Rashid Hussein met with Amina's mother in his office on the third floor of an old building in the city center. The office was small, with a few chairs for visitors and a desk piled high with folders of documents. On the walls hung photographs of happy couples in front of expensive cars and large houses. Hussein explained the procedure. They had to provide photos of the girl, copies of her documents, a medical certificate, and consent to the marriage. The agency's services cost 50,000 rupees, which was a significant amount for Amina's family. However, Hussein promised that if the marriage took place, the groom would usually cover all the expenses and provide a generous dowry. 2 weeks later, Hussein called Amina's mother and said he had found a suitable candidate. Mansour bin Hamad al-Mazroui, a businessman from Dubai, was looking for a young, educated bride from India. Hussein showed a photo of a middle-aged man in traditional white clothing standing next to a black SUV. He said that Mansour owned several hotels in Dubai and a transport company involved in logistics. The man was divorced and had 2 adult children from his first marriage. Now he wanted to remarry a young woman who could run the household and bear him more children. When Amina's parents learned of the groom's age, they were initially skeptical. The 32-year age difference seemed too great. But Hussein convinced them that such marriages were common in Arab countries and that Mansour would be able to provide Amina with a comfortable life that they could never give her. He also mentioned that Mansour was willing to pay a dowry of $20,000 and cover all the wedding expenses. This money could help the family marry off their 2 younger daughters. Her parents showed Amina the photo. The girl silently looked at the image of an unfamiliar elderly man. She said nothing, only nodded. In their family, it was not customary to argue with their parents' decisions. Her mother took this as consent. In January 2024, the process of preparing the documents began. Hussein regularly contacted the partner agency in Dubai that represented Mansour's interests. Both sides exchanged requirements and conditions. Through the agency, Mansour sent a list of requirements for his bride. She must be under 25 years of age, educated, a virgin, with no criminal record or serious illnesses. The last requirement was particularly important to him, and the agency emphasized this several times. Amina underwent a medical examination at a private clinic recommended by the agency. The doctor issued a health certificate stating that the girl was healthy and fit for marriage. The certificate also included a note about her virginity, although the examination itself was superficial and formal. The doctor spent no more than 10 minutes with Amina, asked a few general questions about her health, and wrote the certificate. Later, the investigation would establish that this clinic regularly collaborated with Hussein's marriage agency and issued similar certificates without thorough examination. In February, Mansour sent an official marriage proposal through the agency. The document was written in Arabic with an English translation. It listed the terms of the marriage, the size of the dowry, and the obligations of both parties. According to the document, after the marriage, Amina was to move to Dubai and live in her husband's house. She was forbidden to work without his permission. She was obliged to run the household and obey her husband's will in accordance with Islamic traditions. In exchange, Mansour undertook to provide for her financially, provide housing, and pay all living expenses. Amina's parents signed the document without going into details. The main thing for them was that their daughter would be provided for and able to live in Dubai, where, in their opinion, everything was better than in their poor neighborhood in Kerala. They did not think about how a 21-year-old girl who had never left her state would feel in a foreign country with an unfamiliar man who was old enough to be her father. After signing the preliminary agreement, the visa application process began. Mansour used his connections to arrange a bride visa for Amina. The process took about 3 weeks. During this time, the girl continued to attend college classes, but became even more withdrawn. Her classmates later recalled that in the last weeks before her departure, Amina often sat alone in the corner of the classroom, staring out the window and hardly talking to anyone. When asked what was wrong, she replied that everything was fine. On March 7th, Amina received her passport with a visa. A ticket for a flight to Dubai was purchased for March 10th. The girl had only 3 days left to pack her things and say goodbye to her familiar life. Her mother helped her pack her suitcase. They bought several new dresses, underwear, and cosmetics. Her father gave Amina a small amount of money that he had saved especially for her. Her younger sisters cried and hugged their older sister, not fully understanding that she was leaving forever. On the evening of March 9th, relatives gathered at the house. Aunts, uncles, cousins came. They had a small farewell dinner. The guests congratulated her parents, saying that Amina was lucky to be marrying a rich man and living in Dubai. Some of the female relatives whispered among themselves, discussing the large age difference, but no one voiced their doubts aloud. In the cultural environment in which Amina grew up, a woman's fate was determined by her parents' decision, and her opinion was rarely taken into account. On the morning of March 10th, her father drove Amina to the airport. The drive took about 2 hours. They hardly spoke. Her father tried to say something several times but stopped mid-sentence. At the terminal, he hugged his daughter, wished her happiness, and quickly left without looking back. Later, he admitted to investigators that he felt guilty but could not have done otherwise. For him, it was the only way to secure his daughter's future and help the whole family. Amina checked in, dropped off her luggage, and headed for the boarding gate. The flight to Dubai lasted about 3.5 hours. The girl sat by the window, looked at the clouds, and did not touch the food offered by the flight attendants. A passenger sitting next to her later said that she looked scared and nervous, took out her phone several times, looked at photos, but did not call anyone. The plane landed at Dubai International Airport at around 8 p.m. local time. Amina passed through passport control, collected her luggage, and exited into the arrivals hall. She had never been to such a large airport before. Everything around her seemed huge, noisy, and frightening. She looked for the sign with her name on it, as the agency had instructed her. A few minutes later, a man in traditional white clothing approached her. It was not Mansour, but his driver, whom he had sent to meet his bride. The driver took her suitcase and gestured for her to follow him. They went out to the parking lot, where a black SUV with tinted windows was waiting. The driver opened the back door, and Amina got in. The car was large, with leather seats and the air conditioning running at full power. The girl was shivering, even though the interior was cool. The driver did not speak English, but silently drove through the evening streets of Dubai. Amina looked out the window at the skyscrapers lit up by neon lights and the wide highways filled with expensive cars. It was all so far from her quiet town in Kerala. 40 minutes later, the car turned into a private neighborhood with large villas behind high fences. The driver stopped at the gate of one of the houses, pressed a button on the remote control, and the gate slowly opened. Amina saw a 2-story mansion with a white facade, large windows, and a well-kept garden. Mansour bin Hamad al-Mazrouei himself was standing near the entrance. Mansour looked older than in the photographs. His face was lined with deep wrinkles. His beard was streaked with gray, and his eyes were cold and appraising. He stood motionless, his hands clasped behind his back, and looked at the girl as a buyer appraises merchandise. Amina got out of the car, lowered her eyes, and greeted him quietly in broken English. Mansour did not reply, but nodded to the driver, who carried the suitcase into the house. Then he turned and went inside without waiting for the bride. Amina hesitantly followed him. Inside, the house was even more impressive. Marble floors, high ceilings, a large chandelier in the hall, a wide staircase leading to the second floor. Everything was impeccably clean and tidy, but completely lifeless. No family photos on the walls, no personal belongings, no signs that anyone lived here. The house resembled an exhibition hall of expensive furniture. Mansour led Amina to the second floor and showed her the room. It was a large bedroom with a huge bed, a separate bathroom, and a dressing room. He briefly explained in English where everything was, said that tomorrow morning the maid would show her the rest of the house, and left, closing the door behind him. Amina was left alone in a strange room, in a strange house, in a strange country. She sat down on the edge of the bed and took out her phone. Several missed calls from her mother. The girl dialed the number, but no one answered. Due to the time difference, her parents were already asleep. She wrote a short message. "I've arrived. Everything is fine. I'll write tomorrow." Amina hardly slept that night. She lay on the huge bed, listening to unfamiliar sounds, trying to get used to the idea that this was now her life. Somewhere downstairs, she could hear footsteps, the sound of the TV. Then everything fell silent. Mansour didn't come to her room. The girl did not know whether to be happy about this or not. In the morning, the maid knocked on the door. Maria, a 45-year-old Filipina, had been working in Mansour's house for 7 years. She spoke English with a strong accent, but it was understandable enough. Maria showed Amina around the house, showing her the kitchen, living room, dining room, and master's study. She explained that she did the cooking and that Amina didn't need to do anything. Mansour usually left for work in the morning and returned in the evening. The house also had a room for the security guard, who worked shifts with his partner. Their main task was to watch over the property and the gates. Maria showed Amina the house rules. She was not allowed to enter the master's study without permission. She was not allowed to open the gates on her own. All purchases and trips outside the house required the master's permission. Maria said this in a calm tone, as if she were listing ordinary household rules. For her, having worked in Arab families for many years, such rules were the norm. Amina spent the first few days mainly in her room or in the garden. Mansour hardly spoke to her. In the morning he left for work, returned in the evening, dined alone in the dining room, watched TV, and went to his room. Sometimes he asked Amina short questions: how she was feeling, if she needed anything, if she was getting used to the heat. The girl answered in monosyllables, trying not to look him in the eye. She felt awkward and scared to be around this silent stranger who was now considered her husband. The wedding was set for March 11th, the day after Amina's arrival. Mansour wanted to hold the ceremony quickly and without unnecessary fuss. He did not arrange a big celebration, as is often done in Arab families. Only the bare minimum, an official marriage ceremony according to Sharia law in a mosque, in the presence of witnesses and a representative of the imam. On the morning of March 11th, a representative of a marriage agency from India arrived at the house, having flown in especially for the ceremony. He was accompanied by a translator, a middle-aged woman who was supposed to help Amina understand what was happening. Mansour's 2 brothers with their wives and his adult son from his first marriage also arrived. A total of 10 people gathered. Amina was given a traditional Indian wedding dress to wear, which her parents had sent her. It was a red sari with gold embroidery and jewelry that her mother had given her. The girl got dressed in her room with Maria's help. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she hardly recognized her own reflection. She looked like a bride from the Indian movies she had watched as a child. Only in those movies, the brides were always happy. Around noon, everyone went to the mosque. It was a small mosque in the Al-Barsha district, not the most famous or visited. Mansour had deliberately chosen a quiet place where there would be no unnecessary witnesses or curious onlookers. The ceremony was quick and formal. The imam read the prayers, asked the mandatory questions, and Amina and Mansour confirmed their consent to the marriage. The girl repeated the words after the interpreter, not fully understanding their meaning. The whole process took less than half an hour. After the ceremony, a small lunch was served at the house. The guests congratulated the newlyweds, wishing them happiness and many children. Mansour's brothers' wives looked at their new sister-in-law with curiosity, whispering to each other in Arabic. Amina sat quietly, barely touching her food, answering questions with nods. Mansour's son, a 25-year-old man, did not speak at all to his stepmother, who was younger than him. He sat through the entire lunch with a gloomy expression, clearly unhappy with his father's decision to remarry. By evening, the guests had left. The house was quiet again. Maria cleared the table, washed the dishes, and went to her room. The security guard took over the night shift. Amina went up to her bedroom, changed into simple home clothes, and sat down by the window. It was getting dark outside, and lights were coming on in the windows of the neighboring houses. Somewhere out there, other people were living their lives, with their own problems and joys. And she was here, locked in a golden cage, not knowing what would happen next. Around 10 o'clock in the evening, Mansour knocked on the door. Amina started in surprise and opened the door. He stood on the threshold in his home clothes, looking at her with a long, appraising gaze. Then he asked if she was ready to fulfill her marital duties. His voice was even, emotionless, as if he were asking if she wanted tea. Amina didn't know how to respond. She remained silent, her eyes downcast. Mansour took this as consent. What happened next, Amina would later recall as the most terrifying experience of her life. Mansour behaved rudely and demanding. He was not physically cruel, but his coldness and indifference to the girl's feelings were worse than any violence. For him, it was simply an act of possessing property that he had legally acquired. He did not talk to her, did not ask about her condition, but simply did what he considered his right. When it was over, Mansour got up, got dressed, and left the room without a word. Amina remained lying on the bed, trembling from shock and humiliation. She did not cry. Her tears had ended somewhere around the time the plane took off from Kerala. Now she just lay there and stared at the ceiling, trying to understand how her life had turned into this. The next few days passed in a strange limbo. Mansour continued to go to work, come home in the evening, and sometimes visit Amina at night. They hardly spoke. The girl spent her days at home, sometimes going out into the garden, trying to read the books she had brought with her, but unable to concentrate. Maria tried to cheer her up, cooking her favorite dishes and trying to get her to talk, but Amina remained withdrawn and silent. Her only connection to her former life was her phone. Every day, Amina called her mother and told her that everything was fine, that her husband provided well for her, that the house was beautiful, that she was getting used to it. She lied easily and naturally because she couldn't tell the truth. She couldn't explain to her mother, who was so happy about this marriage, that her daughter was unhappy, that she felt like a thing that had been bought and paid for, that every day here seemed like an eternity to her. Her mother, for her part, was delighted. She told her neighbors and relatives what a nice house her son-in-law had, how much money he gave Amina, what a stroke of luck it was for their family. Her younger sisters envied their older sister and dreamed of also marrying a rich man from Dubai. Her father remained silent, but in the evenings he often looked at a photograph of his daughter, which stood in a frame on the shelf. A week after the wedding, Mansour showed his dissatisfaction for the first time. One evening, he came home from work earlier than usual, called Amina into the living room, and said that he did not like the way she was behaving, that she was too quiet, too withdrawn, that a good wife should be more open and cheerful, that he had paid good money for her and expected her to behave accordingly. Amina tried to explain that it was difficult for her to get used to her new life, that she needed time. Mansour listened to her and said that she hadn't had enough time, that she should have prepared for this marriage in advance. Then he added that he would check whether she was worthy of being his wife, that if he found out that she had been deceived, that she did not live up to what the agency had promised, she would regret it. These words frightened Amina. She did not understand what Mansour meant, but there was a threat in his voice. He did not come to her that night, nor the next 2 nights. He avoided her, hardly ever appeared at home, left early in the morning and returned late at night, immediately going to his room. Maria noticed the changes in her employer's behavior. She had known Mansour for many years and had seen him in different states of mind. After his divorce from his first wife, he had been gloomy and irritable for a long time. Then he calmed down and became more reserved. But in recent days, he had been nervous again, often talking on the phone and raising his voice. Several times, the maid heard him yelling at someone on the phone in Arabic. She didn't understand all the words, but she got the general idea. Mansour was angry, demanding answers from someone, accusing them of cheating. One morning, when Mansour left for work, Amina heard Maria talking to the security guard in the kitchen. They were speaking in English, and the girl couldn't help but overhear their conversation. Maria said that the owner had called some agency the night before, swearing, demanding his money back, saying he had been cheated. The security guard asked what was going on, and Maria replied that she didn't know for sure, but it seemed that the owner was dissatisfied with his new wife, that he suspected that he had been given the wrong girl, not the one he had been promised. Amina felt cold at these words. She returned to her room and tried to remember all the details of the marriage, the medical certificate she had received at the clinic, the documents her parents had signed, the conditions specified in the marriage contract. And then she remembered. The agency had stated in the documents that she was a virgin. That was one of the groom's main requirements. But Amina was not a virgin. 2 years ago, when she was 19, she had a brief relationship with a classmate. It lasted only a few months. Then the young man transferred to another college and they broke up. Amina didn't tell anyone about it, not even her friends. In their conservative society, premarital relationships were taboo. If her parents found out, it would be a disgrace to the whole family. When Amina underwent a medical examination before the wedding, the doctor asked her a few formal questions and issued a certificate. There was no real examination. The girl assumed that this might be discovered on her wedding night, but hoped that Mansour would not pay attention to it or attach any importance to it. Many modern men did not attach importance to such things, but Mansour, as it turned out, was not one of them. Now Amina realized she was in danger. If Mansour really believed he had been deceived, he could do anything. The UAE had strict laws, but for foreign wives without connections or money, there was virtually no protection. She was in the country on a visa that her husband had arranged. Her passport was in his safe. She had almost no money, only the small amount her father had given her. She had nowhere to go. Amina tried to call her mother, but she did not understand the seriousness of the situation. Her mother said that all brides go through difficulties in the first weeks of marriage, that she needed to be patient and obedient, and that her husband would surely appreciate her in time. She did not hear the panic in her daughter's voice, did not understand that she was asking for help. On the evening of March 18th, Mansour came home later than usual. Amina heard the car door slam, heard him climb the stairs heavily, heard him go into his study and close the door. After a while, he called Maria and told her to prepare dinner for 2. The maid was surprised. Mansour usually dined alone, but she silently obeyed the order. When dinner was ready, Mansour called Amina to the dining room. The girl went downstairs, feeling her heart pounding in her chest. They sat down at the table opposite each other. Maria served the food and went to the kitchen. Mansour began to eat in silence, not looking at his wife. Amina did not touch her plate. After a few minutes, he put down his fork, leaned back in his chair, and looked at her. His gaze was cold and harsh. He said that he had called the agency that had arranged their marriage, that he had demanded an explanation, that he had been told that all the documents were in order, all the conditions had been met, and the claims were unfounded. He paused, then added that he didn't believe the agency, that he wanted to hear the truth from Amina herself. The girl was silent. She didn't know what to say. If she lied, he could check it. If she told the truth, the consequences could be terrible. Mansour repeated the question, this time louder and harsher. Amina lowered her eyes and quietly admitted that she was not a virgin before marriage, that she had had a relationship with a young man 2 years ago, that she did not know it was so important to him, that the agency had issued a certificate without a real examination. Mansour listened silently. His face showed no emotion, but his hands were clenched into fists. When Amina finished speaking, he slowly got up from the table. He stood motionless for a few seconds, then turned and left the dining room. The girl heard him go upstairs and slam the door to his office. Then there was silence. Amina sat at the table, unable to move. Maria looked out from the kitchen and saw her frozen daughter-in-law and the untouched dinner. She approached and quietly asked if everything was all right. Amina did not answer. The maid helped her up and accompanied her to her bedroom. As she left, she whispered that the girl should lock the door for the night. There was alarm in her voice. Amina did not sleep that night. She lay on the bed fully clothed, listening to every sound in the house. Something banged downstairs. Footsteps were heard, then silence again. The clock on the wall counted down the minutes. 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock. It was beginning to get light outside. Nothing happened. In the morning, Mansour left for work as usual. He didn't go to his wife, didn't say a word. Amina spent the day in her room, not even coming out to eat. Maria brought her food, but the girl didn't touch her plate. She sat by the window all day, looking at the street, trying to figure out what to do next, but there was no way out. On the evening of March 19th, everything changed for good. When Mansour returned home, he was a different person. His face was calm, almost peaceful. He had dinner, watched TV, then went upstairs. Around 11 p.m., he knocked on Amina's door. The girl opened the door. Mansour stood on the threshold in his home clothes, his face calm, almost indifferent. He asked if he could come in. Amina nodded and stepped aside. Mansour closed the door behind him and sat down on the edge of the bed. He was silent for a few minutes, looking around the room as if he were seeing it for the first time. Then he spoke. He said he had been thinking all night and all day. That he understood she was young, that she had had her own life before him, that perhaps he had overreacted. His voice was even, almost soft. Amina felt the tension ease a little. Maybe everything would be all right. Maybe he would forgive her. Mansour got out of bed and went to the window. He stood there, looking at Dubai at night through the glass. Then he turned to Amina and asked if she had loved that guy. The girl didn't know how to answer. She mumbled something indistinct about youthful foolishness, about how it was a long time ago, and didn't mean anything. Mansour nodded as if he didn't care. Then he asked if she understood that she had disgraced him. There was a new tone in his voice. Not a shout, not anger, but something cold and harsh. He said he had paid good money for her, that he had a right to get what he had been promised, that he had been deceived, and deception was an unforgivable insult in their culture. Amina tried to say something in her defense, but he cut her off with a sharp gesture. Mansour took a step toward her. Amina instinctively stepped back. He asked if she knew what he could do to her for this deception. That under Sharia law, a husband had rights she couldn't even imagine. The girl felt a chill run down her spine. She whispered that she was sorry, that she didn't want to deceive anyone, that the agency had issued the certificate without her knowledge. What happened next happened very quickly. Mansour grabbed her by the shoulders, tightly, painfully. Amina screamed and tried to break free, but he was much stronger. He pinned her against the wall and hissed in her face that she had disgraced him in front of his family, the agency, and himself. That he would not allow some girl from a poor Indian village to make a fool of him. Amina tried to push him away, hitting his chest with her hands. This only made him angrier. Mansour slapped her across the face with his open palm. The blow was hard, and the girl felt the metallic taste of blood in her mouth. She screamed, but Mansour covered her mouth with his hand. Then he dragged her to the bed. The next few minutes were a nightmare. Mansour beat her, choked her, and yelled at her in Arabic. Amina tried to defend herself, scratching his hands and trying to bite him, but the strength was unequal. At one point, he wrapped both hands around her neck and began to squeeze. The girl tried to breathe, but no air came in. She scratched his hands, tried to push him away, but with every second her strength was fading. Black circles floated before her eyes. The last thing she saw was Mansour's face, contorted with rage, above her. When he let go of her neck, Amina fell lifelessly onto the bed. Mansour stood over her for a few seconds, breathing heavily. Then he leaned over and checked her pulse. Nothing. He took a step back, looked at his hands, at the girl's motionless body on the bed. His face was impassive. No remorse, no shock, only cold calculation. He left the room and went down to his office. There he sat for about an hour, thinking about the situation. Then he picked up the phone and called the private security company he worked with. He explained that there had been an accident, that his wife had fallen and hit her head. He needed help. The person on the other end of the line advised him to call the police and an ambulance immediately. Mansour thanked him and hung up. He went back up to the bedroom. He looked around the room. There were signs of a struggle on the sheets. The pillows were on the floor, and one of the bedside tables had been moved. Mansour tried to make it look like an accident. He turned the nightstand on its side and laid Amina down as if she had fallen and hit her head on the corner. Then he noticed scratches on his hands and neck, traces of her resistance. He went to the bathroom, washed the scratches, and changed into clean clothes. He put the blood-stained robe in a bag and hid it in the far corner of the dressing room. Around midnight, he went downstairs and woke up the security guard. He said that something had happened to his wife, that she had fallen and was unconscious. He ordered the guard to call the police. The guard, a Filipino named Ramon, had only been working in the house for 2 months and did not dare to argue with his employer. He dialed the emergency number and reported the incident. The patrol arrived 15 minutes later. 2 Dubai police officers went up to the bedroom. One of them immediately realized that the girl was dead. He called for backup and forensic experts. The second officer stayed downstairs with Mansour, asking him questions. Mansour calmly told his version of events. They had quarreled over a trivial matter. His wife had become upset, started pacing the room, slipped, and hit her head on the corner of the nightstand. He tried to help her, but she was already not breathing. The officer recorded the testimony without expressing any doubt or sympathy. In Dubai, the police were used to such calls. Domestic conflicts, accidents, sometimes something more serious. But protocol is protocol. They had to wait for the forensic experts and the pathologist. An hour later, the investigation team arrived. The senior investigator, Major Khalid Al-Shamsi, had been working in the homicide department for 23 years. He had seen it all. When he went up to the bedroom and examined the scene, his experience told him that this was not a simple case. The position of the body was not consistent with a fall. The marks on the neck indicated violence. The disorder in the room looked staged. The forensic investigators began their work. They photographed the scene from different angles. They took measurements. They collected samples from the sheet, the carpet, and the nightstand. They examined the body. The pathologist who arrived with the investigation team conducted a preliminary examination right there at the scene. He immediately noted that the marks on the neck did not correspond to blows with a blunt object. They were finger marks, strong, prolonged pressure. The girl also had abrasions on her hands, as if she had been defending herself. There was a bruise on her face from a blow. Major Al-Shamsi went downstairs and questioned Mansour again. This time the questions were tougher. How exactly did the quarrel happen? What was it about? Were there any previous conflicts? Why were there finger marks on his wife's neck if she fell on the nightstand? Mansour did not lose his composure. He explained that he had tried to perform CPR and may have pressed too hard, that he was in a panic and did not remember all the details, that he was not guilty of anything. The investigator ordered Mansour to be taken to the station to give an official statement. He also ordered that everyone who had been in the house that evening be questioned. Maria was woken up in the middle of the night, frightened and confused. She told everything she knew, that she heard screams from the bedroom around 11 p.m., that she wanted to go upstairs to check, but was afraid, that then there was a sound of a blow, followed by silence, that around midnight, the owner came downstairs and told the security guard to call the police. The security guard, Ramon, also gave a statement. He confirmed that Mansour called him around midnight and said that his wife had fallen, that he seemed calm, even too calm for someone whose wife had just been injured. He noticed scratches on the owner's hands when he handed him the phone to call the police. Amina's body was taken to the morgue for a full autopsy. The examination took 2 days. The conclusion was clear. Death was caused by strangulation with hands. The time of death was between 11 p.m. and midnight on March 19th. There were multiple injuries on the body, bruises on the arms, abrasions on the wrists, a mark from a blow to the left cheek, and finger marks on the neck. All injuries were sustained shortly before death. There were no signs of alcohol or drugs in the blood, no chronic diseases that could have led to sudden death. Expert conclusion: violent death as a result of asphyxiation from compression of the neck. Forensic experts examined the entire house. In the bedroom closet, they found a plastic bag hidden in the corner with a blood-stained robe inside. The examination confirmed that it was Amina's blood. Fibers from her clothing and skin cells were also found on the robe. DNA analysis showed that the robe belonged to Mansour. The video surveillance system in the house was checked. There were cameras at the entrance, in the first-floor hallway, and in the garden. There were no cameras on the second floor, but the recordings showed that at around 9 p.m. on March 19th, Mansour went up to the second floor. Then, at 10:50 p.m., the surveillance system in the hallway was turned off. Experts determined that it was turned off manually from a remote control located in the owner's office. The camera was turned back on only at 11:40 p.m. after Amina's death. The recording shows Mansour going downstairs, entering his office, leaving a few minutes later, and going to the bathroom. Then he goes back upstairs. Investigators seized Mansour's phone and Amina's phone. An examination of the mobile devices showed that in the last days before her death, Amina had tried several times to contact her mother, writing long messages that she then deleted without sending. Data recovery made it possible to read these drafts. In them, the girl wrote that she was afraid, that her husband was threatening her, that she did not know what to do. In the last unsent message, written on the morning of March 19th, she wrote, "Mom, if something happens to me, know that I love you. I'm sorry I couldn't be a good daughter." Mansour's phone contained correspondence with a representative of the marriage agency. On March 17th, he wrote, "You deceived me. She is not a virgin. I demand my money back." The agency replied that all the documents were in order and that the claims were unfounded. On March 18th, Mansour wrote to another contact, a man named Youssef. "If she is not pure, I will destroy her. No one will make a fool of me." This message became key evidence of premeditation. On March 21st, 2 days after Amina's death, Mansour bin Hamad al-Mazrouei was officially arrested on suspicion of murder. He was taken to a detention center in Dubai. During questioning, he continued to insist on his version of an accident, but the evidence spoke against him. His lawyer, an experienced criminal specialist, advised him to change his defense strategy and admit to a conflict, but not to intentional murder, to claim that the death was accidental in the heat of an argument. Information about the case leaked to the local media. Several Arab newspapers published short notes about the death of a young Indian woman in the home of a wealthy businessman. No names were mentioned, but the details were recognizable. A discussion began in the Indian community in Dubai. Some sympathized with the girl's family, while others said she was to blame for cheating on her husband. Traditional views on premarital virginity were strong in both Arab and Indian cultures. Amina's parents learned of their daughter's death from a call from a representative of the Indian consulate in Dubai. Her mother fainted, and her father was taken to the hospital with a heart attack. Her younger sisters wept, unable to comprehend how their older sister, who had hugged them goodbye just 10 days earlier, was now dead. The consulate helped with the paperwork for repatriating the body. The Indian government covered the transportation costs. Amina's body was brought to Kerala on March 26th. The funeral was quiet, without unnecessary attention. Her parents did not want publicity. Neighbors and relatives whispered, discussing the circumstances of her death, gossiping that the girl was not a virgin and that her husband had killed her because of that. Some said that she was to blame, that she had disgraced the family. Others sympathized with her parents, saying that marriage agencies deceive people, that young girls should not be given to old men. In Dubai, the investigation continued. Major Al-Shamsi pieced together the full picture of what had happened. Mansour found out that Amina was not a virgin either on their wedding night or a few days later. This enraged him. He felt that he had been deceived, that he had paid for a product that did not match the description. For several days, he thought about what to do. He called the agency and demanded an explanation, but they refused to return his money. His anger grew. On March 19th, he made a decision. That evening, he went to Amina and questioned her. The girl confessed to her past relationship. That was the last straw. Mansour lost control and killed her. Perhaps initially he only wanted to punish her, to scare her, but he went too far. Or perhaps the murder was a conscious decision. His correspondence with Youssef, in which he wrote, "I will destroy her," suggested the latter. The investigation also established that Mansour had a history of aggressive behavior. His first wife filed for divorce due to domestic violence, although the official reason for the divorce was irreconcilable differences. Several maids who had previously worked in his house quit because of his abusive treatment. One of his former business partners said that Mansour had a quick temper and could be dangerous when angry. The Dubai Public Prosecutor's Office decided to refer the case to court. The charge: premeditated murder with aggravating circumstances. Under UAE law, intentional murder is punishable by death or life imprisonment. Aggravating circumstances: the victim was the defendant's wife, was under his authority and protection, and the murder took place in the home where she should have felt safe. The trial began in June 2024. The trial was held in the Dubai Criminal Court. The hearings were closed to the press at the request of the defendant's family. Mansour was defended by a team of 3 lawyers who tried to prove that the death was the result of an unintentional quarrel, that their client did not plan the murder, and that he acted in the heat of the moment. The prosecution was represented by the Public Prosecutor's Office. The prosecutor, an experienced lawyer with 20 years of experience, built a clear case for the prosecution. He presented all the evidence gathered to the court: the pathologist's report, forensic evidence, witness statements, and correspondence from the defendant's phone. Particular attention was paid to a message in which Mansour wrote, "I will destroy her." According to the prosecutor, this proved premeditation. The defense tried to discredit the evidence. They claimed that the correspondence had been taken out of context, that the phrase, "I will destroy her," was an emotional statement, not a plan of action, that the shutdown of the surveillance cameras was an accidental technical malfunction, that the scratches on Mansour's hands appeared when he tried to give his wife artificial respiration, that death was the result of an accident during the conflict. The court heard Maria's testimony. The maid recounted in detail what she heard that night. screams, blows, then silence. She admitted that she was afraid of her employer, that he was often rude to the staff, and that there was an atmosphere of fear in the house. The defense tried to portray her testimony as unreliable, claiming that the maid could have confused something or made it up out of revenge against her former employer. Security guard Ramon also testified. He confirmed that he had seen scratches on Mansour's hands and that the employer had been unusually calm when reporting the incident, that it did not seem like the behavior of a man who had just lost his wife in an accident. The court heard from forensic experts. They explained in detail that the marks on Amina's neck could not have been caused by attempts at resuscitation. They were marks of violent strangulation that lasted at least 3 minutes. The victim actively resisted, as evidenced by the abrasions on her hands and the scratches on the attacker's hands. DNA analysis confirmed that the blood-stained robe found in the dressing room belonged to Mansour, and that the blood on it was Amina's. The defense was unable to explain why he hid the robe if the death was accidental. The prosecutor called in a domestic violence specialist from the Dubai Victim Support Center. The expert explained to the court that such cases are, unfortunately, not uncommon. Young brides from poor countries in South Asia often become victims of violence at the hands of older, wealthy husbands from Arab countries. Cultural differences, language barriers, isolation, and dependence on their husbands make them particularly vulnerable. Many do not seek help because of fear of deportation or pressure from their families. The defense objected, arguing that the expert was bringing bias and stereotypes to the case, that their client did not fit the description of a typical domestic tyrant, that he was a respected businessman, father of 2 children, who had never previously been charged with a crime. But the prosecutor presented information about Mansour's previous marriage. He called his first wife as a witness. The woman reluctantly recounted years of marriage filled with humiliation and physical abuse. She described how she feared her husband and how she had been hospitalized several times with injuries that she explained away as falls and clumsiness. She said that the divorce had been a salvation for her. This testimony seriously undermined the defense's case. The trial lasted 3 months. During this time, 14 hearings were held, 23 witnesses were heard, and dozens of expert reports and documents were presented. The public did not have access to the trial, but the Indian community in Dubai followed developments through unofficial channels. Many hoped for a fair verdict. On September 21, 2024, the court announced its verdict. Mansour bin Hamad al-Mazrouei was found guilty of the premeditated murder of his wife under aggravating circumstances. The court found that the defendant acted deliberately, that he planned to punish his wife for her past, and that the murder was the result of cold calculation rather than passion. The evidence included correspondence in which he threatened to kill his wife, the disabling of CCTV cameras before the crime, attempts to stage an accident, and the concealment of evidence. The sentence: 25 years imprisonment without the right to early release. The court also ordered the convicted man to pay Amina's family compensation of 500,000 dirhams, which is approximately $136,000. According to Islamic law, this amount is called diya, blood money paid to the family of the murdered person. The defense appealed, but the appeals court upheld the sentence. Mansour was transferred to a maximum security prison in Dubai, where he was to serve his sentence. Amina's family received compensation, but the money could not bring their daughter back. Her mother fell into a deep depression, and her father never recovered from his heart attack and became disabled. Her younger sisters continued their studies, but the shadow of their older sister's tragedy fell over the entire family. Neighbors still whispered behind their backs, discussing the shame Amina had brought on the family. The marriage agency that arranged the marriage continued to operate. The owner, Rashid Hussein, was questioned by investigators, but no criminal case was brought against him. Formally, the agency did not violate any laws and provided all the necessary documents. The clinic that issued the fake virginity certificate received a warning from the medical authorities, but continued its practice. Amina Paraman's story is yet another tragic example of how cultural traditions, inequality, and violence can lead to the destruction of a young life. A girl who, just a few weeks ago, dreamed of a future, of education, of a normal life, became a victim of a system that treated women as commodities to be bought and sold. In Dubai, a city of skyscrapers and luxury, many similar stories are hidden behind the glittering facades. Stories of domestic workers who are beaten by their employers. Stories of young brides from poor countries who find themselves trapped in violent marriages. Stories of those who are deprived of a voice and protection. In the morning, the maid entered the room on the 23rd floor of the hotel, located in Dubai's business district. She was supposed to check why the guests were not answering calls from the reception desk. It was quiet inside. The air conditioner was running at full power, keeping the room temperature at around 18 degrees Celsius. 2 people were lying on the bed, a man in his 50s and a young woman. Both were unconscious. The maid immediately called hotel security, and an ambulance arrived a few minutes later. The doctors pronounced both of them dead. The man was quickly identified as Khalid al-Manshari, a representative of one of the influential families in Abu Dhabi. He was involved in real estate and investments and often visited Dubai on business. Khalid was not a public figure, but he was well known in certain circles. He had a reputation as a man who preferred to stay in the shadows, but at the same time did not deny himself pleasures. That evening, he rented a room for 2 days, paying in cash, which is not uncommon for such guests. It was more difficult to identify the girl. She had no documents with her, only a passport with a photo that clearly did not match her face. The passport was in the name of Elena Voronina, 28 years old, a Russian citizen. But the girl looked younger, and her facial features were different. The police began an investigation, and a few days later, it turned out that the passport was fake. It had been purchased about 2 years ago in one of the districts of Sharjah, where such services are provided without unnecessary questions. The girl's body was sent to the morgue. The pathologist determined that she had died of asphyxiation. Traces of vomit were found in her respiratory tract, indicating that she had been unable to clear her throat and had suffocated. Death occurred approximately 3 or 4 hours after the man's death. Khalid died of a massive stroke that occurred during sexual intercourse. His heart could not withstand the strain, although he had not complained of any health problems prior to that moment. Numerous bruises of varying ages were found on the girl's body, on her ribs, arms, and back. Some of them were fresh, while others had been healing for several weeks. Investigators began to examine the room. The girl's phone was lying on the bedside table. It was unlocked, and the battery was almost dead. Inside, they found messages, photos, and several videos. One of them was made about a week before her death. The video shows a man, presumably Khalid, hitting the girl in the face and telling her to be quiet and not try to call anyone. The girl is crying and trying to cover her face with her hands. The man repeats several times that if she tries to escape, she will be found and killed. The video lasts about a minute. The quality is average, but the faces of both are clearly visible. Another recording was made 3 days before the tragedy. In it, the girl is sitting on the floor in the corner of the room and speaking to the camera. She introduces herself as Lisa Carter, says that her real name is Elizaveta Sokolova. She is 25 years old, and she is from Moscow. Lisa explains that she is recording this video in case something happens to her. She says that she has been held against her will for 2 years, that she is forced to work for men she does not choose. Lisa mentions several names, including Khalid. She says she tried to escape twice, but was caught, beaten, and threatened with the murder of her family in Russia. At the end of the recording, she apologizes to her parents and says she loves them. The girl wore a thin gold chain with a small pendant around her neck. On the back of the pendant was an engraving with the initials ES and the date, August 18, 2004. This was the date of birth of Elizaveta Sokolova. The chain was a gift from her parents on her coming of age, and she never took it off. This became one of the first pieces of evidence that the girl was indeed Lisa. The Dubai police contacted their Russian colleagues and passed on the information about the find. In Moscow, they began checking the databases of missing persons. A few days later, confirmation came. Elizaveta Sokolova had been listed as missing since the end of the summer of 2022. Her parents, Anna and Mikhail Sokolov, had filed a report with the police, but the search had been unsuccessful. The girl had disappeared without a trace, and the only thing that could be established at the time was that she had left Moscow voluntarily, buying a plane ticket to Istanbul. Anna and Mikhail lived in an ordinary Moscow apartment on the outskirts of the city. Mikhail worked as an engineer at a factory, and Anna taught at a school. Lisa was their only daughter. She studied at the Foreign Languages Department, spoke English well, and dreamed of traveling. After graduating from university, Lisa got a job at a travel company, helping to organize tours abroad. She was a sociable, energetic girl with many friends. Her parents did not notice anything strange in her behavior until she disappeared. In the summer of 2022, Lisa told her parents that she was going to Bali with a friend. She showed them photos of beaches and said that she wanted to relax and have new experiences. Mikhail and Anna did not object, although they were a little worried. Lisa promised to call every day and send photos. For the first few days, she did call and send photos. Then the connection was lost. Her parents tried to call her and sent her messages, but Lisa did not respond. A week later, they received a short message from her saying that everything was fine. She was just busy and would be back soon. After that, the connection was lost again. Mikhail and Anna waited another 2 weeks, then went to the police. Investigators began an investigation. It turned out that Lisa had indeed bought a ticket to Istanbul, but had not flown to Bali. She spent several days in Istanbul, staying at an inexpensive hotel in the Taksim area. After that, her trail went cold. According to border control data, Lisa left Turkey and flew to Dubai. There she passed through passport control, but there was no further information. Surveillance cameras at the airport recorded her in the arrivals hall, but then she disappeared from view. Her parents couldn't understand what had happened. Lisa had never mentioned wanting to go to the Emirates, and she had no acquaintances there. Anna tried to contact the friend with whom Lisa was supposedly going to Bali, but she said she knew nothing about the trip and had no plans to go anywhere with Lisa. It became clear that the girl had lied to her parents and left alone, but why remained a mystery. Mikhail hired a private detective who tried to find at least some clues. The detective checked Lisa's correspondence on social networks and talked to her colleagues and friends. Several people recalled that a month before her disappearance, Lisa had started communicating with someone on the internet. She did not share any details, but mentioned that she had met someone who had offered her a job abroad. Lisa said it was a good opportunity to earn money and see the world. Her friends didn't think much of it, assuming she was just excited about the idea and would soon forget about it. The detective requested access to Lisa's accounts, but most of her correspondence had been deleted. Only a small portion of the conversations could be recovered. In one of them, Lisa was communicating with a man named Dmitry, who introduced himself as the manager of a modeling agency. He offered her a job in Dubai, promising a good salary and paid accommodation. Lisa asked questions about what her duties would be, but Dmitry avoided giving direct answers, saying that they would discuss everything in person. He sent her plane tickets and asked her not to tell anyone about the trip, so as not to jinx it. Lisa agreed. It was a classic recruitment scenario. Dmitry used a tried and tested scheme. He promised easy money, created the illusion of caring, and then isolated the victim from her loved ones. When Lisa arrived in Dubai, she was met at the airport. The girl was taken to an apartment in one of the city's residential areas, where her documents were immediately taken away under the pretext of applying for a work visa. Instead of working as a model, she was told that she would be meeting men for money. When Lisa tried to refuse, she was beaten and locked in a room. They explained to her that she now had to work off her debt for the ticket, accommodation, and visa. The amount was enormous, and Lisa was told that if she tried to escape, they would find and kill her, as well as take revenge on her family in Moscow. Lisa spent the next 2 years in Dubai. She was transported from one place to another and forced to meet with different men. Sometimes she was kept in apartments, sometimes in hotels. She had no freedom of movement and was constantly monitored. Lisa tried to escape several times. Once she got out of the apartment when the guard fell asleep and ran to the nearest shopping center. She tried to ask the security guards for help, but they quickly found her and brought her back. After that, she was beaten so badly that she couldn't get out of bed for several days. The second time, she tried to contact the Russian consulate via the internet, but her correspondence was intercepted, and she was punished again. Khalid al-Manshari was one of her regular clients. He had met with Lisa several times during the last 6 months of her life. Khalid preferred girls with Slavic features, and Lisa fit his requirements. He paid her well for her time, but was often rude and aggressive. Lisa was afraid of him, but she had no choice. For their last meeting, Khalid booked a hotel room for 2 days. They were supposed to spend time together, and Lisa knew it would be difficult. She recorded a video on her phone telling her story, hoping that if something happened, someone would find the recording and understand the truth. That night, Khalid took a large dose of Viagra, even though doctors had warned him about his heart problems. He was sure he could handle it, but during sex, he had a stroke. Khalid lost consciousness instantly, his body going limp. Lisa was frightened and tried to revive him, but to no avail. She tried to reach for the phone to call an ambulance, but couldn't. The phone was on the table, and she was too weak to get up. She began to panic, and at that moment, Lisa started vomiting. She couldn't clear her airways, choked, and lost consciousness. Death came a few hours later. When the police began their investigation, it turned out that Khalid was not the only client of the network Lisa had fallen into. Behind this business was an organized group involved in human trafficking. There were several such groups operating in Dubai, working covertly and using complex schemes to avoid the attention of the authorities. Girls were recruited via the internet, promised jobs as models, waitresses, or nannies, and then forced into prostitution. Their documents were taken away immediately. They were isolated from the outside world and kept in a constant state of fear. The Dubai police arrested several people who were connected to this network. Lisa's parents flew to Dubai to collect their daughter's body. It was the most terrible trip of their lives. Anna couldn't believe that her daughter was dead, that she had been suffering for the last 2 years and couldn't call for help. Mikhail held it together, but inside, he was torn apart by pain and helplessness. At the morgue, they showed them Lisa's body. Anna recognized the necklace around her neck and burst into tears. It was the only thing that connected them to their daughter, the only proof that it was really Lisa. The Russian authorities opened a criminal case on the grounds of human trafficking and tried to identify everyone involved. Investigators questioned Dmitry, the manager who had recruited Lisa. He turned out to be an ordinary middleman who received a commission for every girl he brought in. Dmitry lived in Moscow, had a criminal record for fraud, and had already been caught in similar schemes. He did not know what happened to the girls after they flew abroad, and claimed that he was simply helping them find work. The court did not believe his version of events, and Dmitry was sentenced to prison. The story of Lisa Sokolova did not become a major scandal. The UAE authorities preferred not to blow the case out of proportion so as not to damage the country's reputation. Several of those arrested received prison sentences, while the rest went into hiding. The al-Manshari family paid for Khalid's funeral and tried to hush up the story by removing any mention of his death from the press. Lisa's parents returned to Moscow with their daughter's coffin. They buried her in a small cemetery in the Moscow region, where they often visited her grave. Anna was unable to cope with the loss. She dropped out of school, stopped leaving the house, and barely spoke. Mikhail tried to stay strong, but inside he was also broken. They blamed themselves for not being able to protect their daughter, for not understanding the trap she had fallen into. Friends and relatives tried to support them, but words could not ease the pain. Lisa's phone, which was found in the hotel room, was given to her parents. They looked through all the records, read the correspondence, and understood what their daughter had gone through. It was unbearable, but Anna and Mikhail wanted to know the truth. They wanted to understand what had happened to Lisa, why she had been unable to escape, why no one had helped her. There were few answers, but one thing became clear. Lisa had fought to the end, trying to survive and return home. The investigators understood that Lisa's story was just the tip of the iceberg. There were several groups operating in the city that used similar schemes and kept girls from different countries in similar conditions. They needed to find out who was behind the network that Lisa had fallen into and how deeply this structure was rooted in the Emirates. Farida al-Shahi, a 42-year-old woman who had been working in the police for 20 years, was appointed to investigate the case. Farida was one of the few women in her unit and had earned the respect of her colleagues through her professionalism and tenacity. She had been dealing with similar cases for several years and knew how criminal groups operated. Farida understood that the investigation would be difficult because such organizations always had cover and connections in law enforcement. Nevertheless, she was ready to see it through to the end. First, Farida examined Lisa's phone. In addition to videos and correspondence, there were photos that the girl had taken secretly. Some of them showed the faces of the men who had come to see her. Farida sent the photos to the forensic department to try to identify these people. The phone also contained geolocations of several places where Lisa had been held in recent months. These were apartments in different areas of Dubai, in Deira, Barsha, and Al Nada. Farida sent teams to check these addresses. The first apartment was located in an old residential complex in the Deira district. The building was unremarkable, unguarded, with peeling paint on the walls. The police went up to the 5th floor and knocked on the door. No one answered. They broke down the door and went inside. The apartment was empty, but signs of recent human presence were evident. There were mattresses on the floor, empty water bottles, and cigarette butts in the rooms. Cheap curtains hung on the walls, and the windows were tightly closed. In one of the rooms, they found women's clothing, cosmetics, and several passports thrown in the corner. The passports belonged to girls from Ukraine, Moldova, and Uzbekistan. The police began checking these documents. The second apartment was found in a more respectable neighborhood, Barsh. It was a modern residential complex with security and video surveillance. The police requested the camera recordings for the last 2 months. The recordings showed different men entering the apartment several times. Their faces were partially hidden, but 2 of them were identified. One of them turned out to be a local businessman who owned several beauty salons and massage parlors. The second was a taxi driver who worked illegally and moonlighted as a courier for various dubious services. Both were detained for questioning. The businessman, whose name was Omar, initially denied any connection to the apartment. He claimed that he had only been there once by mistake, but when he was shown the records showing that he had entered and left several times, Omar changed his testimony. He said that he had rented the apartment for an acquaintance who had asked him for a favor. Omar claimed that he did not know what the apartment was needed for and received a small amount of money for the rent. Farida did not believe him, and the investigators began to dig deeper. It turned out that Omar had connections with several people suspected of human trafficking. His beauty salons were used as places where girls were brought for initial selection. There they were examined, photographed, and decisions were made about where to send them next. The taxi driver Karim was more talkative. He admitted that he had driven girls from the airport to various apartments several times. Karim said that he didn't ask any questions, just carried out orders and received cash payments. He knew something was wrong because the girls looked scared, and the men who accompanied them were rude and threatening. Karim named several people who had ordered his services. Among them was Tarek, who had already been arrested, and several others whom the police did not yet know about. Farida compiled a list of suspects and began checking each one. It was painstaking work because many of them used fake documents and were living in the country illegally. Some managed to flee as soon as the arrests began. But 3 more people involved in running the network were detained. One of them turned out to be a key figure, a man named Jamal, a Syrian citizen who had been living in Dubai for 10 years. Jamal had a legitimate business. He owned a small transport company that dealt with freight transportation. But in reality, his company was a cover for criminal activity. Jamal was smart and cautious. He never contacted the girls directly, always acting through intermediaries. He managed the financial flows, decided who to send where, and controlled the entire chain. Jamal was the person who made the most profit from this business. When he was arrested, he remained calm and showed no emotion. During questioning, Jamal refused to speak, referred to his lawyer, and did not admit guilt. But Farida knew she had enough evidence to prove his involvement. During a search of Jamal's home, a laptop and several flash drives containing data were found. They contained tables with the names of the girls, their arrival dates, the amounts they had to work off, and lists of clients. These were detailed records that had been kept over several years. Farida passed the data on to analysts, who began to sort through the information. It turned out that about 150 girls had passed through this network over the past 5 years. Most of them were from former Soviet countries: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, and Kazakhstan. Some of them returned home, some remained in the Emirates, and the fate of many was unknown. The police began checking databases of missing persons and tried to determine how many of these girls could have been victims of the same scheme. They found about 20 matches. These were girls who had disappeared under similar circumstances. They had left the country supposedly to work and then vanished. Their relatives had filed reports, but the search had been unsuccessful. Now it became clear that many of them had fallen into the same network as Lisa. Farida contacted the law enforcement agencies of the countries where these girls came from and began to coordinate joint efforts. One of these girls was Anastasia Kovaleva from Kiev. She was 23 when she disappeared 3 years ago. Anastasia was studying to be a nurse, working part-time at a hospital, and dreaming of saving money to continue her education. One day, she saw an ad online for a nursing job at a private clinic in Dubai. The salary was high, and the conditions were good. Anastasia responded, had a video interview, and was offered a contract. She told her parents that she was going to work and promised to send money. She called them for the first few weeks, and everything was fine. Then the connection was lost. Her parents became worried, tried to call her, wrote to the clinic, but were told that Anastasia had quit and left. No one has heard from her since. Anastasia's name was on the lists found at Jamal's place. Next to her name was a note. Worked for 8 months, sent to Abu Dhabi. The Abu Dhabi police began an investigation, but Anastasia could not be found. Either she was in hiding, or she was no longer alive. Anastasia's parents, upon learning of the investigation, flew to Dubai, hoping to get at least some information about their daughter. Farida met with them and told them what she knew, but could not give a definite answer as to whether Anastasia was alive. The parents returned home with the hope that their daughter would be found, but with each passing day, that hope faded. Another girl on the list was Marina Levina from Minsk. She was 26 years old, worked as an administrator at a fitness club, and was raising her young daughter alone. Marina dreamed of giving her daughter a good education, but she didn't have enough money. She saw an offer for a job as a hostess in a restaurant in Dubai. The salary was decent, and they promised accommodation and a visa. Marina agreed. left her daughter with her mother, and left. For the first 2 months, she really did work as a hostess and sent money home. But then her passport was taken away, and her working conditions changed. Marina was forced to meet with men and threatened that if she refused, she would be deported without any money and would not be able to support her daughter. Marina agreed because she was afraid of losing everything. She worked for another 6 months and then disappeared. Marina's mother filed a report with the police, but no trace of her daughter was found. Marina's name was also in Jamal's documents. Next to her name was a note: "Problematic, transferred to Sharjah." The Sharjah police began a search, but Marina was never found. Perhaps she ran away and went into hiding somewhere, afraid that she would be found and punished. Or perhaps she was killed so that she could not tell what she had seen. Marina's fate remains unknown, as do the fates of many other girls on that list. Farida understood that the investigation could drag on for years. Many of those involved had disappeared, and those who had been arrested did not want to talk. But she was determined. Farida knew that every detail uncovered was a chance to save at least one life, to prevent one tragedy. She continued to work, interrogate, and collect evidence. During the investigation, it was established that the network Lisa had fallen into was part of a larger international structure. Girls were recruited not only in Russia and the CIS countries, but also in Eastern Europe, Africa, and Asia. They were brought to Dubai and then distributed to various countries in the Persian Gulf, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, and Saudi Arabia. Similar schemes were in place everywhere, and there were people who controlled this business everywhere. It was a large-scale operation that brought in millions of dollars in profits annually. Farida contacted Interpol and passed on the information to them. A joint investigation involving several countries was launched. It was a long and difficult process, but gradually new suspects were identified, arrested, and the chains were broken. However, it was almost impossible to completely destroy this network. Others took the place of those who had been arrested, and the business continued because there was demand. Lisa's parents followed the investigation from afar. Mikhail regularly called Farida, asked about progress, and hoped that at least some of the guilty parties would be punished. Farida always answered honestly and did not hide the difficulties. She understood the parents' pain and tried to do everything possible to ensure that justice prevailed. Anna, on the other hand, hardly spoke, withdrawing into herself and silently grieving her loss. The only thing she did was write a letter to several human rights organizations, asking them to help in the fight against human trafficking. Some organizations responded, began to publish materials, and draw attention to the problem. But in practice, there were few changes. Criminal groups adapted, began to operate more covertly, and used new technologies for recruitment. Instead of open advertisements, they began to work through closed groups on social networks and messengers, where they checked each new member. They became more cautious, changed their schemes, and used cryptocurrency for payments so as not to leave any traces. The fight against them was becoming increasingly difficult. Let's go back to that night at the hotel. Khalid took a large dose of Viagra, despite doctors warning him about his heart problems. He was 52 years old, overweight, and had high blood pressure, but he ignored these facts. That evening, Khalid wanted to impress, to prove to himself that he was still young and strong. Lisa was there against her will. She had been brought to the hotel a few hours before the meeting, given instructions on how to behave, and warned that if she tried to escape or call for help, the consequences would be serious. Around midnight, Khalid suffered a massive ischemic stroke. A blood vessel in his brain burst from overload. His blood pressure skyrocketed to critical levels, and his heart couldn't cope. Khalid lost consciousness instantly. His body went limp and fell onto the bed. Lisa was frightened. She tried to shake him and call out to him, but he did not respond. The girl understood that she needed to call an ambulance immediately, but she was afraid. Her phone was on the bedside table, but she didn't dare pick it up. She was afraid that if she called, she would be blamed for what had happened, punished, or handed over to the police, who would deport her without trial. Lisa rushed around the room, trying to figure out what to do. She checked Khalid's pulse. There was none. The man was dead. The girl began to panic. She started to hysterically cry, unable to breathe normally, suffocating from fear. Lisa sat down on the edge of the bed, trying to calm down, but her body wouldn't obey her. Suddenly, she began to feel nauseous. She tried to run to the bathroom, but didn't make it in time. The vomit got into her airways. Lisa tried to cough it up, but her throat was blocked and she couldn't breathe. She fell to the floor and tried to get up and reach the sink, but she didn't have the strength. The girl was suffocating. She scratched the floor with her fingernails and tried to roll over, but her muscles wouldn't work. She was running out of oxygen, and her consciousness began to fade. Lisa knew she was dying, and there was nothing she could do about it. The last thing she thought about was her parents. She imagined their faces, remembered how her mother had hugged her before she left, how her father had waved goodbye. Lisa wanted to ask for forgiveness, wanted to say that she loved them, but the words wouldn't come out. A few minutes later, her heart stopped. Lisa's body was found a few hours later. She was lying on the floor between the bed and the bathroom, her face blue, her eyes open. Khalid remained on the bed in the same position in which he had died. The door was locked from the inside, and no one heard what had happened. The air conditioner was running at full power, keeping the temperature low, so the bodies did not begin to decompose quickly. It was only when the maid entered in the morning that the tragedy became known. The pathologist determined the exact cause of death for both of them. Khalid died of a stroke, caused by a Viagra overdose and physical exertion. Lisa died of asphyxiation caused by vomit entering her respiratory tract. If she had called an ambulance in time, Khalid might not have been saved, but she herself would have survived. The fear instilled in her by those who kept her in slavery cost the girl her life. She feared more than death. She feared punishment. She feared for her parents. She feared what would be done to her if she broke the rules. Lisa's parents only learned all the details of that night a few weeks later, when they received the full report of the investigation. Anna couldn't finish reading it. She closed the folder and never opened it again. Mikhail read everything, from the first page to the last. He wanted to know the truth, no matter how terrible it was. He realized that Lisa could have survived if she hadn't been afraid. This realization tore him apart inside. His daughter did not die at someone else's hands, but from the fear that had been instilled in her during 2 years of slavery. The trial of Jamal and the other members of the network took place 6 months later. Jamal was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Omar, the owner of the beauty salons, received 15 years. Karim, the taxi driver, received 7 years for aiding and abetting. Tarek, who directly controlled Lisa and the other girls, received 20 years. Several other people received sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years. But many of those involved were never found. They fled abroad, changed their names, and continued the same business in other countries. Mikhail and Anna did not attend the trial. They did not want to see the faces of those who had destroyed their lives. The verdict was read to them over the phone, and they simply nodded without saying a word. Justice had formally prevailed, but that brought no relief. Lisa would not return, and nothing could change that fact. Farida closed the case 8 months after the investigation began. She did everything she could, but she understood that it was only a drop in the ocean. Human trafficking continued. Girls continued to disappear, die, and suffer. Farida continued to work on other cases, but Lisa's story stayed with her. Every time she saw a photo of another missing girl, she remembered Lisa and wondered if they would be able to save her. The story of Lisa Sokolova is the story of one girl out of hundreds who disappear every year. She dreamed of seeing the world, earning money, helping her parents. Instead, she lived in fear for 2 years, endured violence and humiliation, and then died of suffocation on the floor of a hotel room because she was afraid to call for help. Her death could have been prevented, but it wasn't. The system that kept her in slavery killed her long before that night. It killed her will, her hope, her desire to fight. And when the moment came when she could have saved herself, she didn't dare to act. When 29-year-old Elena Morozova learned of her illness, she sought support from her influential husband. But instead of help, she received a death sentence, which he carried out with his own hands, staging a suicide near a tree in the vicinity of Al-Watba. Elena Morozova grew up in an ordinary family in Samara, graduated from the pharmaceutical faculty, and worked for a long time in a local pharmacy, where customers came with everyday requests: painkillers, nose drops, ointments for bruises. She had no plans to move or ambitious career goals, but by the age of 27, her life had become measured and predictable. Her colleagues remembered Elena as a neat girl who avoided conflict and preferred tried and tested methods. She did not share her personal experiences and did not maintain active pages on the internet. At the same time, friends noted that Elena dreamed of a change of scenery and sometimes brought up the possibility of going abroad, not with a specific goal in mind, but rather as an abstract dream. She met Faisal al-Harti through acquaintances who were involved in the trade of medical equipment between Russia and the United Arab Emirates. Faisal flew to Samara to negotiate investments in a production line. He owned several medical clinics in Dubai and was looking for suppliers of diagnostic consumables. At one of the meetings, a consultant on pharmaceutical products was needed, and Elena was recommended as an experienced specialist. She came to the meeting, answered technical questions, and discussed the requirements for drug certification. Faisal was 23 years older than her, looked respectable, and carried himself with business confidence. He did not flirt or act familiar, but at the end of the meeting, he suggested continuing the conversation, first through correspondence, then through video calls. Elena agreed. For several months, they exchanged messages. Faisal talked about his projects, and she responded neutrally, but regularly. He did not insist on personal meetings, but when he returned to Samara 6 months later, he invited her to dinner. The meetings continued, and it soon became clear that Faisal was serious about the relationship. He suggested that she move to Dubai and get married according to local laws. Elena consulted with her parents, who were wary of the proposal, the age difference, the different culture, the long move. But she made the decision on her own. In 2021, they got married. The ceremony was modest, without much publicity. Elena moved to Abu Dhabi, where Faisal owned a villa in the suburban area of Al-Watba. The villa was located in a gated community, surrounded by a low fence and a garden with a small swimming pool. Nearby were similar houses belonging to businessmen and managers of local companies. Elena led a quiet life. She took care of the house, sometimes attended English classes, and rarely posted anything on social media. Her page contained several photos with her husband, taken on vacation or in a restaurant, but without personal comments or details. Friends from Russia wrote to her from time to time, asking about life in the emirate, but Elena replied briefly and formally. She did not complain or share her experiences. Faisal continued to run his business. He managed several clinics specializing in aesthetic medicine and routine diagnostics, and also owned shares in medical centers that served the insurance programs of large corporations. In business circles, he was considered a cautious investor who avoided risky deals and preferred gradual expansion. His reputation was built on stability and compliance with contracts. He communicated with partners from different countries, participated in tenders for the supply of medical equipment, and monitored the image of companies. He did not publicize his personal life. Even close acquaintances knew little about his wife. Elena did not appear at business meetings and did not accompany her husband to events. This seemed natural. In the local culture, many families preferred separate activities, where women did not participate in the public part of the business. The first year of their life together passed quietly. Elena gradually mastered the new language and got to know her surroundings. 2 housekeepers worked in the house. One did the cleaning, the other cooked and helped with shopping. Both were from Southeast Asia and spoke simplified English. Elena communicated with them politely but distantly. The security guard at the entrance knew her by sight and let her pass without question when she went for a walk or to the shopping center. The neighbors also saw her occasionally, but did not engage in close communication. The neighborhood was quiet. Everyone lived separately, and that suited most people. However, in the summer of 2023, the situation changed. Elena felt unwell. At first, she had headaches and weakness. Then other symptoms appeared that she could not explain by a cold or fatigue. She went to see a doctor at one of the clinics where her husband's acquaintance worked. After a series of tests and examinations, she was diagnosed with a serious infectious disease requiring long-term treatment and precautions. The doctor explained that the disease was contagious and required isolation in the early stages of therapy, as well as regular medication and monitoring. Elena was frightened. She asked for the information not to be disclosed and feared that the diagnosis would become known to relatives or acquaintances. The doctor assured her that medical confidentiality would be maintained, but advised her to discuss the situation with her husband. Faisal learned about the diagnosis from Elena herself. She told him about the test results and the doctor's recommendations. His initial reaction was restrained. He asked about the details of the treatment and the possible consequences for those around her. Elena explained that if precautions were taken, the risk of infection was minimal, but it would take time and regular monitoring. Faisal did not express open dissatisfaction, but in the days that followed, his behavior changed. He began to appear at home less often, spending more time at the office or at meetings, and avoiding physical contact with his wife. Elena noticed this, but did not dare to bring up the subject. She understood that the diagnosis had created tension and hoped that the situation would normalize over time. By the fall of that year, the relationship had become even more distant. Faisal began to insist that Elena not tell any of his business contacts or relatives about the illness. He explained that this was necessary to protect the reputation of the family and the business. He said that any leak of information could damage the trust of the clinic's partners and clients, especially if it became known that there was a person with an infectious disease in his home. Elena tried to explain that the treatment was being supervised by doctors and that she was taking all the necessary precautions, but Faisal would not listen. He repeated that he did not want to take any risks and that she had to keep everything secret. Elena agreed, although she felt isolated and misunderstood. In the winter of 2023 and spring of 2024, the conflicts became more frequent. Faisal began to openly express his dissatisfaction. He said that Elena had become a burden to him, that her presence in the house created risks, and that he could not afford a scandal that could affect his business. Elena tried to calm him down, explaining that the treatment was working and that the doctors expected her condition to improve. But Faisal did not respond to her arguments. He became more aggressive in his statements. In March, during one of their arguments, he yelled at her and threw dishes in the kitchen. The housekeeper, who was in the next room, heard loud voices and the sound of broken glass, but did not intervene. She was afraid of losing her job and did not want to become a witness to a family conflict. Elena felt that the situation was getting out of control. She could not return to Russia without her husband's permission. Under local law, her visa and documents depended on his status, and it was difficult for her to leave on her own. She contacted the Russian consulate in Abu Dhabi and asked for help. Consulate staff interviewed her, ascertained the circumstances, and advised her to file an official statement if she wanted to leave the emirate and return to her homeland to continue treatment. Elena hesitated. She was afraid that the statement would provoke a new conflict with her husband, and hoped that the situation would be resolved without the intervention of official structures. The consulate recorded her request, but did not insist on further action, as Elena did not make any direct complaints of violence or threats. In April, the conflicts reached a critical point. Faisal began to demand that Elena not leave the house at all and not contact the staff. He said he did not want any of the employees to find out about her diagnosis and spread rumors. Elena objected, saying that isolation was worsening her condition and that she needed communication and support. Faisal did not listen. He stated that she must obey his demands, otherwise he would not pay for her treatment and would not give her permission to leave. Elena felt trapped. She wrote to her friend in Russia, but did not dare to tell her everything in detail. She was afraid that the information would reach her parents, and she did not want to worry them. Her friend noticed that Elena was writing less often and that her messages had become more dry and formal, but did not insist on an explanation. On May 6, 2024, Elena contacted her friend in the morning, wrote a few short messages, and then her phone went dead. Her friend tried to call her several times, but the number was unavailable. She decided that perhaps there was a communication failure, or that Elena had forgotten to charge her phone. However, by evening, Elena still had not been in touch, and her friend began to worry. She wrote a few more messages, but there was no response. The next day, she contacted Elena's parents in Samara and told them about her concerns. The parents also tried to contact their daughter, but to no avail. They called Faisal, but he did not answer the calls or call back. This alarmed the parents. They knew that the relationship between the spouses was not easy and feared that something serious had happened. On May 9th, the parents contacted the Russian consulate in Abu Dhabi with an official request for information about their daughter's whereabouts. Consulate officials contacted the local police and asked them to check if everything was okay at Elena's address. The police sent a patrol to the villa. Faisal met the officers at the gate and told them that his wife had left for a walk a few days ago and had not returned. He said that he had searched the area himself but had not found her and was going to file a missing person report. The police asked why he had not done so earlier. Faisal replied that he had hoped his wife would return on her own and that he did not want to cause a fuss. The officers recorded his statement and began their search. On the morning of May 10th, security guards at a private property adjacent to the area where Faisal's villa was located discovered a woman's body. It was hanging from a branch of a low tree in a small grove about a kilometer from the house. Next to the body, on the ground, were a pair of women's low-heeled shoes and a small bag with documents. The guards immediately called the police. The officers who arrived at the scene recorded the position of the body and the circumstances of the discovery. The identity of the deceased was established from the documents in the bag. It was Elena Morozova. The police contacted Faisal, and he came to the scene. He identified his wife and stated that she had apparently committed suicide, as she had recently been depressed due to illness. He remained at the scene and answered questions from investigators. The body was sent for a forensic medical examination. The preliminary report indicated death by mechanical asphyxiation due to hanging. However, the experts noted several details that raised doubts. First, the mark on her neck had the characteristic features of hanging, but the position of the noose under her chin was uneven. In some places, the mark was deeper. In others, it was superficial, which could indicate that the body was hung after death or that the noose was applied in several stages. Second, bruises and small hemorrhages were found on the victim's wrists and hands, indicating a recent struggle or violent restraint. Third, toxicological analysis of the blood showed the presence of sedatives in concentrations significantly exceeding the therapeutic dose. This indicated that the woman may have been sedated beforehand or was in a state in which resistance was difficult. Investigators began a detailed examination of the circumstances surrounding the death. They interviewed the villa staff, the housekeepers, and the security guard. One of the housekeepers, who had worked for Faisal for more than 2 years, initially gave a formal statement saying that she knew nothing about the incident and that everything had been quiet in recent days. However, later, after being questioned again and given assurances of confidentiality, she told a different story. She said that on the night before Elena's disappearance, she heard loud male voices and shouting coming from the bedroom on the second floor. She could not make out the words, but the voices sounded tense and aggressive. In the morning, Faisal demanded that she clean several rooms and take out the trash, but he was nervous and did not explain the reason for the urgency. The housekeeper also noted that Elena did not appear in the house that day, although she usually came to the kitchen for breakfast. She did not dare to ask about the reasons, as she was afraid of causing her employer's dissatisfaction. The security guard at the entrance also testified. He reported that on the night of May 5th to 6th, he saw Faisal's car on the driveway to the villa around midnight. The car stood with its headlights on for a few minutes, then drove away toward a vacant lot. The security guard did not think much of it, as the owner of the villa often left late at night and returned early in the morning on business. However, when investigators asked Faisal about his movements that night, he claimed that he was at home asleep. This contradiction became one of the key points in the investigation. Investigators requested data from the car's navigation system and recordings from surveillance cameras on nearby roads. Analysis of the navigation system data showed that Faisal's car had traveled several times between the villa and the vacant lot, where the body was later found on the night of May 5th-6. The route was repeated twice. First, the car left around midnight and returned an hour later, then left again at 3 a.m. and returned at 5 a.m. This data did not correspond with Faisal's version of events, according to which he spent the entire night at home. In addition, CCTV footage from one of the neighboring villas recorded a car similar to Faisal's driving by at the specified time. The driver was not clearly visible, but the model and license plate matched. Investigators also paid attention to the state of the CCTV system on the grounds of Faisal's villa. The cameras installed at the entrance and in the garden were turned off on the night of the incident. The technician who serviced the system confirmed that the cameras were working properly and had been turned on until May 5th. The cameras were turned off manually via a control panel that only the villa owners had access to. Faisal explained this as a technical malfunction, but experts refuted this version. The system showed no signs of failure, and the cameras were turned off deliberately. At the same time, the origin of the sedative found in the victim's blood was investigated. Toxicological analysis established that Elena's body contained a benzodiazepine drug in a concentration several times higher than the usual therapeutic dose. Such a concentration causes deep sedation, in which a person cannot control their actions or resist external influences. Drugs of this type are used in medical institutions for anesthesia and require a doctor's prescription. Investigators requested information about purchases of medicines in clinics associated with Faisal's companies. The check showed that one of the clinics, where he was a co-owner, purchased a batch of drugs for procedural sedation in March 2024. The drug from this batch matched the substance found in Elena's blood. Faisal denied any involvement in his wife's death. During questioning, he insisted on the suicide theory. He claimed that Elena was depressed due to illness, that she had repeatedly spoken of her desire to die, and that he could not have prevented the tragedy. He also stated that he did not know where his wife could have obtained the sedative, and suggested that she might have received it from the doctor who was treating her for an infectious disease. However, the doctor who treated Elena gave testimony refuting this version. He reported that he had not prescribed her any sedatives and that her condition did not require such treatment. Moreover, the doctor confirmed that Elena showed no signs of depression or suicidal intentions. She was actively interested in the treatment plan and expressed a desire to return to Russia to continue therapy. The investigation continued to gather evidence. A second examination of the site where the body was found was conducted. Experts studied the position of the noose, the nature of the marks on the neck, and the position of the body relative to the tree. The analysis showed that the branch on which the body was hanging was about 2 meters above the ground. Considering Elena's height, 165 centimeters, and the absence of any objects nearby that could have served as a support, the experts concluded that it would have been difficult for her to hang herself. In addition, there were no signs of a struggle or attempts to free herself on the ground beneath the body, which also indicated that the woman was unconscious or semi-conscious at the time of hanging. Additional information was provided by a second housekeeper who worked for Faisal on a part-time basis and came several times a week. She said that in April, she noticed changes in her employer's behavior. Faisal stopped talking to his wife in front of the staff, and Elena became more withdrawn and avoided communication. The housekeeper also recalled that she once saw a fresh bruise on Elena's arm when she accidentally showed her wrist while taking something out of a closet. When the housekeeper asked what had happened, Elena replied that she had bumped into a door and quickly changed the subject. These details, although not direct evidence, reinforced suspicions that there were conflicts between the spouses involving physical violence. Investigators also examined Elena's correspondence with her friend and parents. The victim's phone was seized and sent for examination. Some of the data was recovered. In messages sent in April, Elena wrote to her friend that she felt lonely and that her husband was avoiding her. In one message, she mentioned that she wanted to return to Russia, but was afraid that her husband would not give her permission to leave. In another message, she wrote that she was afraid of conflict and that the situation at home was becoming tense. These messages showed that Elena was aware of the growing problems in her relationship, but did not consider herself to be in immediate danger. The last message, sent on the morning of May 6th, was short and contained no signs of panic or intentions to harm herself. Bank transactions were also investigated. Investigators requested statements for Faisal and Elena's accounts. Analysis showed that in March, Faisal had transferred a large sum from his personal account to one of his companies. The transaction appeared unusual, as no such transfers had been made previously. The amount was several tens of thousands of dirhams. Investigators suspected that the transfer could be related to an attempt to hide assets or prepare the ground for possible legal consequences. However, no direct link between this transaction and the crime could be established. Faisal explained the transfer as necessary to cover the clinic's operating expenses. 2 weeks after the body was found, investigators gathered enough evidence to bring charges. On May 24, 2024, Faisal al-Harti was arrested on suspicion of intentional homicide and concealment of evidence. He was charged with murdering his wife, using sedatives, and then staging a suicide. The investigation indicated that the motive was fear of losing his business reputation and business due to his wife's illness, as well as an emotional reaction to her intention to return to Russia and seek help from the consulate, which could have led to the disclosure of family problems. Faisal's arrest went off without incident. He was taken to a detention center, where he was informed of the charges and his rights. Faisal's lawyer insisted on his client's innocence and stated that all the evidence was circumstantial and did not prove his involvement in his wife's death. The defense argued that the navigation data was not conclusive proof of Faisal's presence in the car. Someone else could have been driving. The shutdown of the surveillance cameras was explained as a technical error, and the presence of a sedative in the victim's blood could have been the result of her taking medication on her own from an unknown source. The lawyer also pointed out that the bruises on Elena's arms could have been caused by accidental injuries, not violence. However, the prosecution had a body of evidence that, taken together, pointed to Faisal's guilt. Contradictions in his testimony, navigation data, deliberate disabling of cameras, access to sedatives through the clinic, testimony from housekeepers and security guards, as well as the nature of the injuries and toxicological data, painted a convincing picture of a premeditated crime. The investigation classified the act as premeditated murder, committed with particular cruelty and using means that made it difficult for the victim to resist. The case was transferred to the Abu Dhabi District Court. A preliminary hearing was held in June 2024. The court accepted the indictment and set a date for the main trial. Faisal was denied bail due to the seriousness of the charges and the risk of obstruction of justice. Elena's relatives from Samara hired a lawyer to represent their interests in the trial. They demanded fair punishment and compensation for the death of their daughter. The Russian consulate provided assistance in legal matters and maintained contact with the family of the deceased. The trial began in July and lasted several months. The hearings were held in camera, as the case contained confidential information about the deceased's medical condition. The prosecution presented all the evidence it had gathered: expert reports, witness statements, navigation data, and toxicology reports. Each piece of evidence was examined in detail. Experts provided explanations regarding the nature of the injuries, the concentration of drugs, and the possibility of staging a suicide. Witnesses confirmed their testimony under oath. The defense attempted to refute the charges by presenting alternative versions of events. Faisal's lawyers argued that Elena could have acted on her own, that she was depressed and took a sedative with the intent to commit suicide. They presented evidence that the infectious disease Elena suffered from was often accompanied by psychological disorders and that she could have concealed her intention to end her life. However, the prosecution refuted this version, presenting evidence from a doctor and Elena's correspondence in which she did not express suicidal intentions and was planning treatment. The court accepted the prosecution's arguments as more convincing. In November 2024, the court handed down its verdict. Faisal al-Harti was found guilty of the premeditated murder of his wife and concealing the traces of the crime. The court established that he used a sedative to render his wife helpless, then took her body to a vacant lot and staged a suicide by hanging her from a tree. The court recognized the motive for the crime as fear of losing his business reputation and an emotional reaction to his wife's illness, which he perceived as a threat to his position and business. The sentence was 25 years imprisonment, confiscation of part of his assets, and payment of compensation to the family of the deceased in the amount determined by the court. Elena Morozova's family received the compensation set by the court and secured the repatriation of her body for burial in Samara. The case did not receive wide media coverage. The Emirates authorities preferred not to publicize the details so as not to draw attention to the high-profile crime in business circles. The investigation was closed, and the materials were transferred to the archives.